Chapter 1032. If Lionel had been there to hear the name Krars, he would have immediately realized that everything the middle-aged man said was true. During the war with Terrain, a few citizens of Krars had ended up getting caught in the conflict. These individuals had all been arrogant and lofty despite the fact they came from worlds like Krars X10 and even YS in some cases. It was no surprise they were so arrogant, though, considering the strength of their world. Now, it seemed that Krars had no choice but to target Earth. When one fold of reality swallowed another, or more accurately, when a higher dimensional fold of reality swallowed a lower dimensional one, the original would be erased and its world spirit would be swallowed. This meant Krars' world would no longer be Krars at all but would rather become a world of Earth. This would effectively cripple an entire generation of Krars citizens. The only way to escape this fate was by claiming territory within Earth's domain and rooting the world spirit to it. In this way, Krars people would have a route to survive and maintain their sovereignty without being swallowed up by another. It could even be said that there were many worlds that had exactly this same thought process. As much as this was about greed for Earth's resources, it was also a matter of survival. Does it seem like their entire focus is on this world? Libli asked. Well, before the middle-aged man could answer, an enormous anchor fell onto the second lake crossing. A pillar of water shot up into the skies, covering up what it was that had landed. At first, Libli immediately went on high alert, as did the individuals hidden in the surroundings. If this was some sort of bomb, they had to be prepared to protect themselves. But, what actually happened next left them stunned. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The pillar of water crashed down, sending a rain into the surroundings. Considering Earth X1 was almost always precipitating anyway, even if there seemed to be no clouds up above, it hardly changed anything. What was a point of caution, though, was what the descending waters allowed to be revealed. A spider beast sat at the center of the second lake crossing. Even without using force, its 8 limbs held it above the waters, its beady, crimson eyes looking like a set of shimmering rubies. It was at least 20 meters long, wore blinding silver armor, and it released a nauseating clicking sound every so often that made one's stomach turn over. It was almost like one could hear its inner organs digesting whatever it was that it had just eaten. On Velatop this spider beast stood a group of a dozen. Compared to the youths sent by the Radix, Rain, Umbra and Flora families, it was clear that these individuals were a tick older. But, this could only be expected. All 4 of those families were of the 6th dimension but could send such experts in currently. As such, they could only send the younger generation. Rho Alpha Alpha the Krars family, though, was just a 5th dimensional family, held back by the weak talent of the Milky Way galaxy overall. As such, most talents they did have were already older, having been stuck at the pinnacle of the 5th dimension for decades already. Except for 2. And these 2 happened to be a pair of twins that stood at the helm of the spider beast, both radiating the aura of a Tier 9 5th dimensional existence. Yet, they were both exceptionally young. If not for knowing better, most would think that they were still in their late teens. I think this hiding isn't doing us any good, right? One of the twins spoke. If none of you will come out, we will simply take this base for ourselves. Veronica. The moment the twins spoke these words, the spider beneath them opened up its jaw and raised its large abdomen into the air. Before anyone could react, a spiraling pillar of webs that sparkled like a cross between silk and diamonds shot upward. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience in just a few seconds, the entirety of Lake Crossing had been covered in a thick platform of web. Just a slight moment of hesitation had allowed the Krars twins to take the initiative. There were truly very few who dared to take a step onto that web. Just at a glance, it wasn't difficult to tell that this web was incredibly sticky. From Libli's calculations, she felt that just walking along it would take about 3 to 4 times the amount of force they would use on water normally just to keep themselves from getting stuck. On top of this, there was a high likelihood that the web was also poisonous and may very well already be spreading a silent killer into the air. Auzen, poison detection. Libli commanded. Yes. The middle-aged man released the moth for just a moment before his expression changed. Nerve-numbing. Airborne. I see. Libly took out her radix cube and fused force into it. With a click, what looked like a spider jumped out with its legs and clamped onto her face. Very soon, the lower half of her face including her nose were covered by a bronze mask. Who has come? Young miss, it seems that the Rain and Flora family have attacked Earth's base. As for the rest, the evergreen clergymen don't seem to have made a move while the Umbra family is very, very difficult to find. That said, there is an uptick of about 0.1% of atmospheric dark elemental force in the general surroundings. According to our information, there's a 97% chance that the Umbra family is already here. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. As Auzin spoke, he too used his radix cube to cover his face. Gather the vanguard, it's time to move. We can't let them do as they please. Libly's words had hardly fallen when several scythes of darkness cut at the large platform of spiders' webs from all sides. The speed was so fast that the twins could only narrow their gazes as a large chunk of their foundation was ripped apart. When it came to a stop, the whispering fog of several shadows drifted into the air, disappearing one after another. However, just one stayed behind, a cheeky grin on his face. This young man was exceptionally pale and was lanky to almost an extreme. And if Lionel had been there to see him, he would have been shocked, because this young man was none other than Radlease, the first friend Lionel had ever made on Valiant Heart Mountain. He twirled twin short swords in his hands as his body seemed to drift into the wind. His legs disappeared into fog and his torso quickly followed suit. Eventually, there was just his head and his cheeky grin remaining. I've been suppressing myself for too long. Since you'd like to play, let's play. That's what my Umbra family does best. The instant Radlease vanished, the clinking of armor resounded as the Radix family charged forth. A three-way battle erupted with hardly any warning, sending the calm water of the lake into a frenzy. Bronze force, dark elemental force, and a spider's web all spiraled out of control. Chaos descended upon the second lake crossing. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1033. The battlefield had less than 50 people taking part. It was clear they all had a tacit understanding that this was a place reserved for elites and elites alone. Anyone else would only be like fodder to a flame. Libly and Radlease clashed with the twins. The latter seemed to flicker in and out of existence as he pleased while the former had already put on an entire mech suit. From a delicate and petite young lady, she had become a bronze behemoth. Back on planet Solara, there were certain delicate mechanisms that she didn't dare to deploy for fear the planet's environment would destroy them. But now she had no qualms at all. Her one enormous bronze arm billowed with the odd bronze force and endless steam. Her slender arm was quick and flexible, sending out blades of energy that pressed one of the twins down. Radley's twin short swords were like arcs of black lightning. They appeared without warning, struck with unconscious speed, and moved like deathly shadows. Not bad. Radlease laughed as he vanished and appeared on a whim. I thought that only those two would be good in this galaxy, but it turned out that there were other talents here too. It's a shame you aren't a woman, or else I'd want to take you as a concubine. The Krar's twin remained indifferent to Radlease taunting. All around him, shields of spider web silk hung around him. In total, there were at least a dozen, each of which was just a foot in diameter. The twins' fingers moved about with a deft swiftness, controlling both these shields and several hiltless blades. In his battle with Libly, the other twin also seemed to use the same silk-based ability, their flexibility in battle coming as no joke. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Just earlier, Veronica, the spider beast, had vanished and became a tattoo on the latter twin's back. However, this was impossible to see as this twin wore flexible armor throughout his body. All that was possible for the others to tell was that these two brothers seemed to have abilities related to the very spider they had just ridden. Radlease suddenly found a silk thread attached to his blade, catching him somewhat off guard. With a quick deployment of his dark elemental force, it began to corrode. But the process was far too slow, showing just the kind of strength these silk strings had. You could never defeat us. The twin spoke plainly. This world is ours. The twin's finger flexed, causing a surge of energy to threaten to snap Radley's wrist if he didn't release his weapon. At the same time, a hiltless blade shot toward his compromised arm, aiming to pierce through the left of Radley's chest completely. Radley suddenly chuckled. I managed to survive that lovesick woman while hiding my strength for 2 years. What makes you think this is enough to deal with me? Donville Radley's back suddenly erupted with tendrils of dark energy. Soon, though, it became clear that they were actually several tails. Of which, there were 3 in total. With a bang, one shattered the ceiling of the speed of sound. Like a streaking shadow, it whipped through the air, slamming against the incoming hiltless blade and sending it spiraling into the air. Before the twin could regain control of it, Radley's tail shot up, wrapping around it tightly and sending it flying. The air felt as though it was being cut apart. The strength of Radley's tail was completely beyond the expectations of the twin. Several of his spiderweb shields shot out, lining up in a line to block the incoming blow. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience SHUU. Pung. 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 It took 3 shields before the blade finally got stuck in the 4th. However, before he could even have a chance at catching his breath, Radley's, who had vanished into thin air, appeared with his short sword at his throat. At that moment, on the other side of the battlefield, Libley's battle with the other twin was raging on just as fiercely. Without having to hold back, Libley's actions flowed far more smoothly from one action to another. It was as though she had an endless supply of mechanisms, each more lethal than the last. Chains, needles, hidden blades and spikes, extending arms and legs. The array of options she had felt infinite, and it was quickly becoming more and more difficult for the second twin to read and react. No matter how many shields he had, none of it seemed to be enough. Libley's massive steampunk bronze arm rotated a quarter, causing several small holes to appear at a joint. An eruption of 9 missiles shot out in a rotating and spiraling circle as though they were coordinating themselves in the air. The twin shot backward explosively, sending out several shields. Trying to use the massive fog as a cover, he sent out several hiltless blades. Beneath the cloud of explosions and their noise, it should have been impossible for Libley to react. The aftershock sent the twin flying, his feet losing their balance as he was blown backward. But, completely out of his expectations, he found that he suddenly couldn't fly any further. To the twin's horror, a chain had wrapped around his ankle. Without even a chance to fight back, he was reeled back into the range of the explosion just in time for the final chain of missiles to implode. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience just like that, at seemingly the exact same time, one twin lost their head and another was blown to bits, falling within split moments of each other. The fog around Libley slowly dispersed while the surge of dark elemental force around Radley's calmed. The darkness that had taken over Radley's gaze began to pale as he looked toward Libley with a fiendish grin. You're quite a beauty. It's a shame that you're not my type. I like more voluptuous women. Radley's gaze went blank as he thought back to the large breasts of Balthorn. He almost began to drool. Libley didn't react much to Radley's words, simply brandishing her weapons and pulling back her chains. But, before the two could battle, the sound of 2 voices caused their pupils to constrict. See, I told you, D. We're at too much of a disadvantage. The Milky Way is too untalented, we can't beat them one-on-one like this. Fuck off, Dre. I'm unresigned. This is bullshit. Wouldn't everything be alright once we take Earth's talent for our own? Then nothing would hold us back any longer. For now, just listen to me. Libley and Radley's turned their gazes to find an enormous bird hovering in the skies. On its back, 2 individuals that they should have just killed stood, perfectly fine as though nothing had happened. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, since our talent isn't good enough, well, just drown them in numbers. At that moment, the sky that was fairly clear aside from the light drizzle of a few clouds suddenly warped. From just a single bird, there were suddenly hundreds, each of them with squadrons of 10 on their backs. Instantly, a battlefield that barely had 50 people suddenly ballooned into one where a side had thousands in a single blink. Libly and Radley's pupils constricted into pinholes. Chapter 1034. Libly, who liked to calculate everything before she even took a single step, realized that she had been played. She couldn't quite grasp what ability had been used to string her along like this, but it didn't particularly matter right now. All she knew was that there was trouble. Scanning the current state of the battlefield, all of her elite troops had been spread apart, as were Radley's. On top of this, they were being pinned down by the elite troops that the twins had led forward earlier, making it difficult for them to regroup. Libly had thought they all had the tacit understanding that this would be a battle of elites and had gotten complacent. After all, as much of a powerhouse as Krars was in this galaxy, their main ability came in their foundation and their numbers. But, if they were willingly tossing such an advantage away, she had been willing to gladly take such a benefit for herself. However, Libly had forgotten one important piece of information. Rho Alpha Alpha Ausen had informed her of where the Rain, Umbra and Flora families had set up their bases. But, he had never said anything about where the Krars family had set up theirs. It was only now she understood that they had never set one up to begin with. From the very beginning, their only target had always been this second lake crossing. Regroup. Libly raised her enormous mechanical arm, pointing its massive fingers forward. Mechanisms on their tips opened up and shot out a rapid hail of bullets as she tried to cover for her people's retreat. But, how could Dee and Dre allow such a thing? They had revealed their true cards at the perfect time and they would most definitely take advantage. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience right at that moment, the birds dove down from the skies. One would have thought that they would slow as they approached the water, but it was the exact opposite. They accelerated like speeding bullets, their feathers ripping from their bodies one after another. However, if one looked closely, those very feathers turned into an odd inky energy as they fluttered away, sinking back into Dre's body. Bang! 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 Dawn Velth birds, without a care for their lives, crashed full speed into the waters below. At that moment, an inky blackness was cast over all of their visions, making it impossible to see what was happening. Before Libly could even regain her bearings as the water beneath her rose and fell like tides, her bronze armor jumped into action on its own, blocking a strike to her left. Libly's gaze narrowed. Her armor only acted without her express command under very few situations. She realized then that her life was truly in danger. The inky blackness dispersed, revealing the state of the battlefield once more. But now, Libly found herself surrounded from all sides. With the Krars having claimed the very center of the battlefield, it had suddenly become impossible for any regrouping to take place. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a terrible move to make as it essentially forced the Krars to be pincered from all sides. However, with so few people being on the battlefield to begin with and many birds still hanging in the skies with hundreds more attackers, it felt like the perfect action for this given situation. Libly immediately found herself embroiled in battle. For the first time in her life, she actually regretted not bringing that massive meathead somewhere. However, she had had no choice but to leave her husband to be back at their base so that there would be someone there to defend should Earth send a preemptive attack. Row visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience we need to retreat. It seems we'll really have to give up this location. If they build an entire base of that spider silk, it'll be difficult to take this back without at least a few thousand troops. But even then, Libly's mind spun as she thought. The bare minimum requirement for attacking this second lake crossing once the Krars had established themselves would be an antidote for this nerve-numbing poison that was slowly accumulating in the air. Not everyone of the Radix family had good enough crafting skill to block this poison like she did. And, the Umbra family was known for their immunity to such things and Libly truly didn't want to let them have the upper hand. Damn it. Retreat. No sequence. Liblis Mass projected her voice over the battlefield. Her words told her men to use whatever means to escape they had. Without a sequence allowed them to scatter. Dre and Dee, who were still in the skies, smirked when they saw the attempted retreat. They acted in unison, fitting themselves into all sort of twinning stereotypes. Fire at will. Dre said lightly. Those who remained on the backs of the birds weren't just anyone, they were the best marksmen the Krar's empire had to offer. They weren't fearful of being pincered because they simply had the best cover imaginable. They had essentially started an air fight on a group of people who were clearly not ready for one. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Radlis' gaze narrowed. When it came to escape, his people were probably the best. But it was difficult when they were forced to engage in battle like this. They needed both time and space to vanish like they usually did. And, unfortunately, the sun was still too high in the sky to lower the requirements. The marksmen above began to target the escaping Radix family members together. If one wasn't enough, 3 or 4 volleys were often sent. The casualties began to slowly increase. It was right then that the situation on the battlefield changed once again. Dre subconsciously looked in a certain direction, his gaze narrowing when he saw an array of speedboats racing down the river. In fact, much like the clergyman, he almost hadn't noticed them at all. Shoot them, do. Dre hadn't even finished his commands when a beam of golden light tore through the skies, ripping through the throat of his bird. In the distance, still just over 2 kilometers away, Lionel frowned, holding his sniper rifle in his hand. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The birds aren't real. In that case, let's do this. Dre and Dee fell from the skies, an inky blackness hanging around them. Unfortunately for them, Lionel had already locked on. Chapter 1035. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a sleek and simple bow. It was the very same bow he had gotten from the Camelot zone. Though it was just a quasi-bronze treasure, when it came to this battlefield, it was already among the best weapons in appearance. And, when it came to matters of marksmanship, Lionel truly didn't need anything more than just this. In the blink of an eye, 6 arrows appeared on Lionel's bowstring at once. As though he hardly needed to calculate anything, they shot outward, piercing through the throats of just as many birds in what felt like an instant. No amount of maneuvering seemed to matter. With every light breath Lionel took, another bird fell from the sky. His single arrow seemed to be capable of covering the whole battlefield. No matter how many barricades you stood behind, no matter how much effort you put into running, it was all meaningless. Lionel's body and the bow seemed to vanish. No, it wasn't that it had vanished, but rather that they seemed to have become one. The twang of the bowstring was no different from a flex of Lionel's arm or a whipping of his leg. The curve of the bow's body was no different from a tensing of Lionel's spine and a priming of his heart. It had been so long since Lionel used a bow, rather choosing to rely on his crafting skill to create powerful sniper rifles. The only reason he was using it now was because he realized that it was a more efficient use of his stamina. Even though the sniper rifle didn't drain him like it once did in the past, it still packed a punch. However, Lionel never expected to suddenly become immersed in this feeling he hadn't touched upon in such a long time. There was something about the bow that existed on a plane separate from the gun. No matter how hard Lionel tried, he always felt that there was a barrier between him and his guns truly breathing as one. And yet, that barrier seemed to be as thin as a sheet of wet paper when he picked up his bow. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel asked himself the same question he had asked of his spear. What was so special about bow force? It was a funny question because Lionel wasn't even certain that he had ever used bow force before. Had he ever grasped it? In truth, he wasn't really sure. He thought he had, maybe, possibly. But, had he really? Likely not. For a long while, he hadn't felt that there was any difference between the weapon forces. They just made things sharper, right? In that case, Why grasp bow force when he could just attach spear force to his arrows? Wasn't it the same thing regardless? Unknowingly, Lionel had restricted his bow force in this way, making what he had comprehended from Merlin's trial quite benign and useless. So, he asked himself again. What separated bow force from other forces? It felt like the answer was range again. In fact, it felt like the answer was range times 10. But Lionel felt unsatisfied with this answer. It wasn't because this answer was wrong. In fact, it was correct. The reason he was unsatisfied was because he felt that it was too simple. Lionel fell into a trance-like state. His fingers moved faster and faster, and the arrows he released seemed to blot out the skies all on their own. Before the boat had even crossed from 2 kilometers away to just a single kilometer, more than half of the birds in the sky had been slaughtered. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience at that moment, Lionel entered the range of the Krar's marksmen, and they began to try to snipe him out of the skies before Lionel could get to them. But that was when something Radlease, Libly, and the twins would never forget in their lifetimes happened. Lionel's speed hit a new gear. He ran out of arrows and simply began to form them with his earth force. His arm became like a blur, and the bowstring often didn't even have a chance to settle before he slotted another arrow in and pulled. At that moment, they all witnessed a single bowman facing off against dozens. Lionel sent out several volleys, his arrows perfectly clashing with the ones the Krar's marksmen released. At first, it was even, and they seemed to have reached a stalemate. The clashing in the skies grew resounding, flashing lights of all colors coming from one side only to be blocked by a curtain of bronze from another. It was as though the arrows had become no different from droplets of rain rebounding against one another in the sky. But then, the situation changed. Lionel's arrows began to skim against the sides of the oncoming arrows. It seemed that he had missed at first, but then it became clear that a single one of Lionel's arrows began to disrupt the path of 2 others. Then 3 others. Then 4 others. Bang! A surging aura burst from Lionel's body. A golden spear light flickered into and out of existence on Lionel's forehead as though it was fighting back against something, but it was to no avail. Lionel's arrows suddenly gained life of their own. Rather than speeding up, his pace suddenly slowed. And yet, under the astonished gazes of those watching on, it wasn't Lionel who began to lose, but rather the marksman of Krar's. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel took a light breath, an arrow releasing along with his exhale. It curved through the skies, skimming against the side of one arrow after another. It used the arrows of the Krar's marksman almost like a racetrack, its trajectory curving along as though it had a mind of its own. Then, shoo! The neck of a bird was pierced right through, the very first one to be felled in the last several exchanges. It felt as though the battlefield had fallen into an eerie silence, a single young man with a blazing aura becoming the center of attention. Range was indeed too simple to describe Lionel's feelings for the bow. When he held it in his hands, he had an indelible confidence. What separated Lionel's bow force from his other forces? It was the fact it was his bow force. With a single arrow, I can do anything. A mighty violet fog billowed to life around him. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1036. What Lionel had needed to understand was why range felt like too simple of an answer to him, and it had only taken a moment to do so. The truth was that it was too simple because Lionel's state of mind when it came to the bow was far beyond his state of mind when it came to the spear. The reality was that despite having a lineage factor related to the spear, and even having the spear domain heirloom, his thought process revolved much more around the bow than it ever did the spear. Much like how switching to wooden spears for a long while helped Lionel grasp something he had been missing, so too did using his sniper rifle for so long. It made seeing the fundamental difference so much clearer. The reality was that Lionel's explanation was much more complex for the bow because if his spear force could be considered to have stepped into level 2, then Lionel's bow force had just entered level 3, skipping over level 2 entirely. Lionel was sure that there were probably names and categories for this stuff already documented, but he had purposely not used the dictionary to learn about them. He didn't want his progress in this fashion to be influenced by anything else. It was quite interesting. Lionel was always worried about missing out and had always wanted to learn as much as he could about everything. But, for some reason, when it came to his spear and his bow, he wanted the exact opposite. Something about them felt deeply personal in a way he found difficult to describe. In the end, he chose to follow his gut. And as things stood now, it was doing wonders for him. Lionel released another arrow, but the result of this one caused the expressions of everyone around to change wildly. The air around the arrow vibrated out of control and the force in the surroundings seemed to distort. It hadn't even reached its destination yet, and yet not a single soul failed to see through its danger. Dee and Dre, who were among the very first to fall victim to Lionel's arrows and lose their bird, had their pupils constrict. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Dre had been waiting for the archers to deal with Lionel first before he deployed his bird once again to command to the battlefield. But to his shock and horror, Lionel alone had actually rendered his men completely useless. And now this arrow, shuu. Lionel blinked. I missed? Lionel was baffled. Even back to the days when he was a normal boy playing quarterback on a football field, he had never missed. It sounded ridiculous, but it was the truth. Lionel couldn't ever remember being inaccurate in his life. And yet, for the first time, he actually missed. Bang! The sight was devastating. Lionel's arrow passed over the head of a bird, missing its neck. However, just as it did so, it was as though everything ruptured. The head and part of the bird's torso was shredded to pieces. The marksman on its back screamed in horror as they too were torn and ripped apart. It was as though a spinning vortex of space element force whipped by, forming a black hole that pulled everything apart and left nothing but droplets of blood, flesh, and an inky blackness. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience. The space in the surroundings continued to tremble as the arrow shot into the distance. As though it was a nuke, everyone on the battlefield scattered, rushing out of the range of the arrow before it could get anywhere near them. Bang! The arrow collided with the calm waters of the second lake crossing. A devastating whirlpool formed and water as sharp as knives and needles jetted out in all directions. Screams of agony and pain erupted. Those that hadn't managed to get far enough away found themselves sucked in, the devastation of the arrow shocking them to their cores and reaping their lives. At least a dozen fell into the silence of death in that one instant. Lionel frowned, raising his hand to his bow again. But, right as he was about to fire again, he felt his forearm spasm and a large chunk of his mental stability vanish. What the hell? Lionel's mind spun, his near-perfect recall activating as he replayed what had just happened. When he came to an understanding, his expression became somewhat solemn. His bow force had actually surpassed a level he could casually sustain. There wasn't much of an impact on his body as bow force came from the external, but his mental focus took a huge hit. It felt as though he was a normal human again and had just spent all day studying. It was exaggerated to the point he couldn't lift a single finger any longer. But, Lionel felt like his current self only had about 2 more of these arrows in him before he really wouldn't be able to think straight anymore. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Unless I use auspicious air. But, even then, I think I would only be able to increase the number by 1. I never thought that would become a problem. What Lionel didn't know was that this was only natural. His so-called level 3 bow force was actually a concept usually only grasped by those at the 6th dimension, something he would know had he done his research. In fact, it couldn't even show its full strength due to Lionel's current limitations. Lionel could sulk about this and be unhappy. But was it even necessary? 3 more of these arrows to end this battle. Lionel grinned. Isn't that too easy? Lionel had had many plans brewing in his mind for how to deal with this battle, but he hadn't expected to have such a breakthrough before it even started. In fact, as long as he wanted, he could lower his bow force to level 2 and not have to worry about this drawback at all. However, where would the fun in that be? It was about time these people understood that what they should fear wasn't those vying for a piece of earth along with them. What they should fear was earth itself. Lionel raised his bow again, his free hand drawing 2 fingers together from the curve of the bow down the string. Everywhere his 2 fingers passed, a shimmering bronze arrow of earth force formed, wrapped in spiraling level 3 bow force. Retreat. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the roars came from all over the battlefield as the same thought resounded in Lionel's mind once again. With a single arrow, I can do anything. Chapter 1037. Lionel had barely drawn his bow into a partial crescent when panic took hold of the battlefield. Libli froze and suddenly couldn't move a single inch. No matter how she calculated, no matter how she racked her brain, she couldn't manage to figure out a method to live. So long as Lionel targeted her, she would die. For the first time in her life, she was 100% certain of a conclusion. The only people capable of resisting that strike were powerful quasi and true 6-dimensional existences. In addition, they couldn't be normal quasi 6-dimensional existences either. Considering how weak the Tier 9 pair of twins had been, losing to Libli who wasn't even Tier 7 yet, it was doubtful that there was anyone born in the Milky Way capable of such a feat. The only chance they had was if Lionel didn't fire at all. But what chance was there of that? Lionel's fingers released from the string, his actions smooth and unhurried. From barely being able to pull this bow to 20% of its potential, Lionel could now pull it to 100% with ease. However, he had chosen not to because it was simply unnecessary. Rippling waves of distorted air pulsed around the flying arrow. At first glance, it almost looked like the warped images one would see around an extraordinarily hot object. The air wasn't steaming, but its surroundings twisted and bent almost like a rippling puddle of water. Protect the princes. The roar came from the back line, but the Krar's warriors all fell into rank. As though this order was an injection shot of bravery, their eyes went red. Visit. For a better user experience a commander type ability? Lionel's gaze narrowed. But this works out well too. Shoo. Several roars shot into the skies, rows upon rows of warriors blocking the path of Lionel's arrow toward Dre. As far as Lionel was concerned, the large number of Krar's warriors was the main roadblock to him capturing this space. So, he hadn't hesitated to target their leaders as he had done from the very beginning. As for the results, they were just as shocking. Lionel's arrows became no different from a screeching projectile shot from a powerful ballista. It tore through the first line of warriors, reaping 3 lives at a time. Even the waters it traveled over split beneath its momentum, creating a violent churning effect that made the situation all the more disastrous. This time, the arrow was on target. Lionel wouldn't be taken off guard by the same thing twice, and he had already adjusted his calculations. The result was an arrow far more devastating than the last. The first casual arrow reaped just over a dozen lives despite hitting nothing but air the whole time. This arrow, however, reaped that many on just first contact. It tore through the army, shredding armors to pieces and twisting flesh and bone into grinding meat paste. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Dre watched on in horror, their hearts trembling. Even the elite warriors they had originally come with found it difficult to even move an inch. The only one who had managed to do anything was the old man who shouted out earlier, but even then he had only done so to protect himself. This is a suppression between dimension. Who is this monster? At that moment, Dre finally understood. They were truly finished. Bang! The arrow finally landed on the waters, a violent churning of water jetting outward. Shards of space followed suit, shredding anyone in its way to pieces. By the time the waters calmed, a quarter of the thousands the Krars had brought had been wiped out. The speedboats finally entered the range of the battlefield, their parachute systems deploying like the wings of a silver bird and their anchors falling. Bow in hand, a dense violet fog hung around Lionel. Fused with his level 3 bow force, it felt like a curtain of gravity had fallen over the second lake crossing, making the knees of those who laid eyes on him weak. Visit. For a better user experience right then, Milan, Raj, Drake and Alan stepped out of the boats ready to fight. However, what they saw when they came out left them speechless. The retreating warriors had come to a grinding halt, not daring to move a single step any longer. A cone shaped had opened up toward the center of the battlefield, followed by a path of blood and gore. And every one of the warriors, despite some clearly being on opposing sides, had locked gazes with Lionel, the fear in them clear. "Hey, Cap. What'd you do?" Raj cleared his throat and squeezed these words out. Alan, however, noticed that Lionel's back wasn't as straight as it normally was. In fact, his skin was paler than usual as well. Whatever it was that Lionel had done clearly took a lot out of him. While it was true that Lionel could fire 2 more of these arrows if he dug deep, that was only if he dug deep. He would only be able to fire 1 more without using his natural force art and relying on auspicious air, so really he only had 1 more in him currently. A theoretical number was far different from the true number. The reason Lionel hadn't pulled his bowstring all the way back was because he was well aware of this. Very rarely could humans reach their true limits. It often took trying circumstances and lack of choice to push someone to that limit. The fact that Lionel only had 1 more in him already put him in a state of sheer exhaustion. However, he still stood there, glaring at the battlefield menacingly as if he could release 100 more so long as they dared him to. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel's gaze swept through the battlefield before it landed on seemingly empty space. The moment it did, it narrowed somewhat, causing that empty space to shudder, releasing a hint of dark elemental energy that had most definitely not been there before. Radlease was forced to appear before the coercion, coughing somewhat awkwardly. "Hey buddy, long time no see. How's Aina? I bet she's just as beautiful as ever, right?" Chapter 1038. Radlease coughed awkwardly. In truth, it could be said that he and Lionel had a decent relationship. They could have been friends had it not been for Radlease maintaining some distance between them by always disappearing to places unknown. However, it was also the case that Radlease had been a help to Lionel at least once before as well. Though it wasn't really a big deal now, back then, it had been about as far out as a person could stick their neck for someone they hardly knew. Back when Lionel had been faced with those 3 seniors, it was Radlease who had run off to get an authority figure who could help out. Even though Lionel hadn't ended up needing the help, had he actually needed it, it could have put Radlease in an awkward situation for the rest of the time he was there. Lionel, of course, recognized Radlease. But he wasn't as surprised as the latter might have thought he would be. Radlease had always been odd to Lionel. He always seemed to be aimless at Valiant Heart Mountain, chasing girls and even joining a Force Crafter guild even though he was clearly not a Force Crafter. And yet, despite being so aimless, he had managed to gain a quota to enter the Valiant Heart Zone. Not only had he entered it, but he had actually managed to be among the few who survived all the way to the end. From that moment, Lionel knew that there was something off about Radlease, but he never pressed to find out because he could tell that the latter was trying to keep some distance between the two of them. In addition, given Lionel's state of mind back then, he didn't really care about the feelings of anyone else outside of Aina, so he hadn't been in the business of making friends. Seeing Radlease here, rather than making things more confusing, actually made things make more sense. At the very least, it made the questions Lionel have about him far more pointed. Had Radlease gone to Valiant Heart Mountain for the Valiant Heart Zone? That was very likely. But why? Was the Valiant Heart Zone enticing even to someone with a background like Radlease? To the point where he would actually choose to infiltrate it? Lionel had to believe that for Radlease's family to be scheming on Earth, they must have gathered a lot of information on the Milky Way. With that information, they should have known that Valiant Heart Mountain was being eyed by 3 other forces all at once. That meant that there was nothing to be gained from establishing yourself in such a place unless your only goal was their treasure. Due to this line of reasoning, Radlease must have entered the Valiant Heart Mountain for the sake of its zone, This would also explain why he didn't show his talent until the crucial moment. But Lionel still felt like he was missing an important part of the puzzle. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Rather than replying to Radley's, Lionel spoke to the army as a whole. You all have two options. Since there are 3 groups among you, they'll let you make the decision for your respective people. The first option is to continue this one-sided massacre. The second option is to surrender and become prisoners of war. Which will you choose? When Lionel's words fell, he had already raised up his bow and began to draw his 2 fingers through the air. Another bronze arrow began to take form, shimmering with bow force that bent and twisted the space around it. Of course, Lionel was only using level 2 bow force currently while masking it with space elemental force to mimic the same effect. But they didn't need to know that. Right? Lionel knew that if he really pushed himself to draw a 3rd arrow, he'd fall into a coma for a long while. If he wasn't here to command the war, then who would? He had too many responsibilities to fall here. I surrender. Lionel raised a brow. The voice was female and came immediately after his words fell. It was clear that this person had made a decision long ago and chose to surrender. Lionel was a bit surprised to find that it was Libli. From what he knew about this young woman, she was quite headstrong. But it seemed that she also knew how to be flexible as well. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience from the look in her eyes, it didn't seem like she was afraid of death. But she also didn't seem like she was faking it either. Lionel nodded her way. As long as Libli surrendered, it meant the rest of the Radix family would follow suit as well. Raj. Gotcha. Raj's chubby fingers moved and a swarm of metallic sand shot forward, wrapping around Libli, who had long since stepped out of her battle suit. I surrender as well. Radley's chuckled. You won't treat me badly, right, Lionel? Toward Radley's casualness, Lionel could only be speechless. Did he not realize how serious these matters were? Or maybe this guy was just always like this? Dee and Dre took this matter the most harshly. The Krar's family had the most to lose in this endeavor, and they had gone all out to fulfill that goal. And yet, their plan had been thwarted like this? Even though Dee and Dre only represented one prong of their attack, they were among the most powerful. What did this say for the rest? However, as much as they wanted to fight back, fear gripped their hearts. The river was still dyed with blood that had yet to be washed away. If they answered wrongly, that could be them. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, brother. Dee's jawline clenched. The twins looked toward one another, their expressions grave. Dre sighed. I'm with you if you're with me. Dee grinned. Might as well go down swinging. This wasn't a casual matter for them. Libli and Radley's might be able to surrender, but that was because their people would be just fine. Their families would likely negotiate a large ransom for their return. However, the Krars could not afford this. All of their chips had been pushed to the center of the table. Even if they couldn't win this battle, they had to weaken Earth as much as they could. Lionel could already tell what their answer would be the moment he saw these looks. Men of Krars. Dee's voice boomed. Protect your homes. Dee and Dre dashed forward through the cone of blood formed amidst the battlefield, taking on the vanguard. If they died, then they died. As princes of their empire, they had to be the last to give up hope. Lionel's gaze narrowed and he waved his hand. Thousands of soldiers swarmed out of the speedboats, the final battle for the second lake crossing beginning. Visit. For a better user experience, unfortunately, it seemed that the finale was already set in stone. Chapter 1039. The battle lasted less than an hour. Even without releasing his arrow, just the oppressive might of Lionel's level 3 bow force was like a domain all to its own. Its presence alone had a suppressive effect on the Krars that lasted until the very end. By the time they realized that this was all because Lionel couldn't casually release such attacks, it was already too late. Dee and Dre found themselves caught much like Libly and Radley's had been. They had wanted to fight to the death, but why would Lionel allow that if he didn't have to? These two represented a treasure trove of information. As for whether they gave it up willingly or via the use of different means, Lionel didn't particularly care. He was sure that there was someone with an ability useful in this respect somewhere. You tricked us. Libly spoke plainly. At this moment, the second lake crossing was no longer empty. It had gained a large metallic cube chained to its surrounding islands as well. Within this metallic cube, Libly, Radley's, and the twins lay in chains while the remainder of their armies had been placed within segmented cubes. Lionel stood before their jail cells, made of the very same material the dark cloud prison of Earth was formed of. Though it didn't work as well against fifth-dimensional existences as Earth had yet to produce such ores at the fifth-dimensional level, it was still good enough to severely weaken them. Lionel shook his head. He hadn't tricked them. If Libly and the others insisted on battling, he would have definitely drawn his arrow once again. Libly was well aware of this as well, which was why despite what she said now, she didn't regret her decision. She was logical almost to a fault, and unless it was strictly necessary, she would never sacrifice herself meaninglessly like the twins tried to. As long as she survived, there would be a chance at another day. But, if she died, any hope there might have been would be lost. It was wholly irrational to fight losing a battle, so she refused to do so. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel ignored Libly for a moment and looked toward Radley's. The latter was still as pale and lanky as ever, but his breath was stronger than it had been in the past. It was clear that he had hid himself deeply and may very well still be hiding himself. For someone who had been captured as a prisoner of war, the smile on his face was too bright. Why did you join Valiant Heart Mountain? Lionel asked. Radley's blinked. Can't a man chase skirts? I'm still in the prime of my youth. Gil, who wasn't too far away, burst into laughter. Hey, Cap. I like him. Maybe we should let him go. Two perverts in a pod. Alan shook his head. What do you know? A sign of a healthy man is his perversion. Only we can allow the true nature of the repressed female to shine forth in its true glory. It's you prudes that are responsible for the double standards those repressed flowers must suffer through. Oh yeah? Milan laughed. There are plenty of brothels on Earth right now and our population's lacking. Why don't you go take a few of those repressed flowers as your wives and have some babies? Gil coughed. Everything in moderation, friend. Everything in moderation. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. The exchange made the boys laugh, especially Radley's, but Libly's expression twisted with a hardly concealed disgust. Was this how men talked when they were alone? She wanted no part of it. Seeing that he wasn't going to get any answers from Radley's in this state, Lionel shrugged his shoulders. The most basic interrogation tactic was to separate your targets and question them individually. Even though Lionel didn't want the same answers out of them as they were from different powers, it would still help to apply some mental pressure on them. After all, they were far too relaxed right now. The only ones who had dark expressions and didn't say a word were the twins, but this made sense since they were in the worst situation. Still, Lionel hadn't bothered to do any of this because he didn't expect deep answers from any of them. Rather, he just wanted to know some surface things. As for what was hidden underneath, he would leave it to those with special abilities to find out. His only purpose was to find out some useful surface information. Your cube, I'm very interested in it. What is it? Libly frowned. But, it wasn't exactly a secret either, so she felt that if this information could allow her to continue remaining here comfortably until someone saved her, that would be fine too. The radix cube is a tradition of our radix family. From the moment we begin to learn crafting and awaken our bronze force, we begin to build our own. During our lifetimes, we'll modify, change and improve our radix cube until it can become more and more powerful. Lionel felt intrigued by this, his eyes glowing until he thought of something. none of you restart? The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. No. Libley's reaction was fiercer than Lionel had expected. She seemed to realize this as well, so she calmed down considerably after a moment. It seemed that Lionel's question had touched on a taboo he wasn't aware of. However, Libley clearly didn't want to say more after this and directly fell into silence. Unfortunately, her outburst had revealed enough. Clearly, this radix cube was a core part of their power and couldn't be easily abandoned. At the same time, though, taking it was also difficult. After all, even after searching Libley, it was nowhere to be found. The only explanation was that it had been absorbed into her body, something that made sense considering how Lionel had originally seen it be taken out. Lionel didn't bother to press any further. If he wanted to know more about the radix cube, he would likely have to take some risks. As for how far he was willing to go, maybe only Lionel was aware. And your bronze force, what is it and what does it do? Our bronze force is capable of invading the structure of metals. On the surface, it seems to just change its color. But, when the bronze force of a metal reaches a certain point, it can then be controlled by our radix family to act and react in ways it wouldn't normally. It's especially useful for crafting small and intricate parts. When you don't have a metal spirit, that is. Libley gazed toward Lionel, clearly remembering why they had clashed the first time to begin with. As for Lionel, he could tell that Libley probably hadn't told him the full explanation, but his alone was enough for now. Finally, Lionel turned his attention toward the twins. However, the result of this was far more complicated than he had expected. Seeing their downtrodden appearances, even setting aside their injuries for a moment, Lionel felt as though something within himself had shifted. Just kill us. Dee said without raising his head. We won't tell you anything. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1040. Lionel gazed toward Dee then his brother for a long while, his expression not shifting very much. Pride in one's world wasn't something Lionel was familiar with. Things like nationalism and cultural pride had already been weeded out by the Ascension Empire long ago. It was easier to bring people together when they didn't believe that there were things that separated them. But, what Lionel realized just now was that this pride hadn't vanished. It had just been buried. There was nowhere to flaunt this pride if everyone around you shared the same identity. Much of Earth's pride turned into one of status and wealth. But, it was also something that anyone could get so long as they performed well enough on the gene assessment. As long as you were talented, building up a noble family in just a single generation wasn't impossible. Lionel himself was a prime example of this. Even though he had no interest in being a quarterback, there was no doubting that it would have made him a very rich and very popular man. The fact he was born on a paradise island didn't hinder his future in the slightest. Due to all of these things, Lionel never truly felt this sinful sort of a pride. In fact, he had always subconsciously rejected it, even to the point he built his future aspirations on hoping this sort of pride never restricted the life of anyone else. But what happened the moment Earth was opened up to the rest of the dimensional verse? Suddenly, what once was a closed system became an open one. The cohesive unit of Earth became a minority and the enemies that surrounded them forced Earthlings to look upon them like the others. What had Lionel thought the moment he stepped onto the battlefield? He had wanted to show these people that the citizens of Earth weren't pushovers and that they were to be feared. But, wasn't that the antithesis of everything he wanted to accomplish? Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ing experience in just a few steps, even he who was consciously aware of it all, or at least assumed himself to be, had fallen victim to the same sort of indoctrination. In fact, the more enemies he defeated in Earth's stead, the further the citizens of Earth would fall into this line of thought. If Lionel made Earth the center of his empire and tried to enact his vision, there would come a day where those who aimed their blades toward him weren't people from the outside, but rather the very men, women, and children he currently protected to his back. Lionel felt a heaviness on his heart at this moment. What was the best sort of trap? The greatest sort of scheme. It was one you knew was there and yet you had to walk into it anyway. And this was very sort of cage Lionel's grandfather had him trapped in. Lionel sighed and looked up toward the metallic ceilings above him. He wasn't ready. He was nowhere near prepared enough to face his grandfather or challenge his ideologies. Who was right and who was wrong didn't matter because regardless of it all, if things continued in this way, Lionel simply had no chance of winning. I want to be a king, but I have not the faintest inkling of how to do that. I don't even really understand myself. How can I grasp the hearts of people I want to follow me? My uncle is probably right to say I have no right to challenge that old man. Lionel closed his eyes, his aura going from turbulent to calm. The emotions that Dee and Dre had showed on the battlefield replayed in his mind again and again. They had put everything on the line just for a chance at weakening the people of Earth just the smallest bit. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience without a word, Lionel turned and left. His teammates looked at one another, but they too remained silent. They didn't feel like there was anything to add to the conversation. Ultimately, they didn't have the same ambitions as Lionel. And while Lionel hated the game of football, they actually quite loved it. It could even be said that Lionel was a rare exception when it came to hating the results of the gene assessment. They followed Lionel because that was what they had always done. This sort of team bonding, relying on each other and having each other's backs is exactly what they lived life for. If they could have a few laughs with their brothers along the way, that was also what they would do. If Lionel wanted to figure this out, he would have to rely on himself. But, once he did, they would be the first to follow. Lionel spent several days building the wooden fort of the second lake crossing. His speed and skill this time was much greater. As for the matter from the first lake crossing, Lionel didn't worry. If things had gone horribly wrong, Arthur would have already contacted him. By the end of the week, everything was prepared. In that time several scouts had come from other regions to see what had happened, but how could they hide from Lionel's internal sight? They were all dealt with swiftly and easily. On the 8th day, there was finally movement. Cap, we just got word from Big Sis M, the latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel looked up, a familiar spear made of vines and a blade of roses lying on his lap. What happened? Do they finally need help? No, Alan spoke as he came into view, a slight sheen of sweat from his daily workout still on his forehead. Something weird is going on. It seems like the other families found out that we caught their geniuses. We captured that Libley and Radley's guy over here, and Arthur, M and the others captured a few of their own. According to the message, they're issuing a challenge. Apparently it's a custom of the dimensional verse to claim their prisoners of war back with one-on-one challenges. Lionel raised an eyebrow. That sounded absolutely ridiculous. They also said that if there was anyone who could defeat their warriors on neutral ground, without the suppression of Earth's fold of reality, they would directly retreat and leave Earth alone. Lionel's expression warped. How shameless were these people exactly? Why did it sound like they were being done a favor? And as if Lionel would believe their nonsense about retreating. They probably realized that Earth wasn't as simple to take a hold of as they originally thought, so they would take this opportunity to retreat to their bases in the Milky Way and wait for a better chance to assault their fold of reality. They might even wait until Earth broke into the 6th dimension so they could send their true powerhouses forward. There was also a good chance that it was a combination of all of these things on top of being a trap. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if they used this so-called neutral ground to make a move. This was war and history was written by the victors. Lionel wasn't naive enough to trust them. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience standing up, Lionel took a step and vanished. Let's go. His voice rang through the air. This is a money-making opportunity. Chapter 1041. The location was the deck of a spaceship. However, to call it as such would be doing a great disservice to the true magnitude of the behemoth that hung among the celestial bodies of this particular solar system. It almost felt far more appropriate to call it a starship. Of course, this would be an exaggeration. True starships were at a minimum capable of rivaling a moon in size, while the largest of them could live up to their namesake and could stand side by side with suns. This one, however, was just 10 kilometers in length, hovering outside the Milky Way's fold of reality. A distance away from this junior starship was a planet that hovered on neutral ground. It wasn't currently claimed by any major powers of the Milky Way Guild and was actually meant to act as a relay station to the starship. Lionel, who had appeared on this planet with his brothers to his back, couldn't help but chuckle. Before Lionel, a middle-aged man with a cold expression stood. His left eye had been replaced by a rolling bronze eyeball and his right was covered in a monocle. Currently, he was the one responsible for manning the teleportation station to the starship hovering overhead. This planet was an edge planet. It existed at the very border of a fold of reality and was valuable for its use as a jumping point. But, outside of that, it was quite barren and lacked in resources. So, not much unlike the asteroid gas station era had gone to for the sake of reporting Lionel, there was hardly anyone here. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, it wasn't just Lionel who had come. Noah and Jessica were present, along with Tyrion and the Moon People. However, they were all infuriated as well. The issue challenged by the six-dimensional galaxies was clearly a blatant provocation. Not only was it a ridiculous excuse piggybacking off of a rule that didn't exist, but they had even insulted the intelligence of the people of Earth a step further by actually placing so many hoops before them for them to jump through. Lionel held an amiable smile on his face even while realizing the situation they were in. Since he had chosen to approach every situation like this until he was forced not to, then he would follow through with that choice, even if it seemed blatantly obvious that the purpose of these people was not pure. I don't think that this would be in our best interest. How about we meet in the middle? Lionel spoke to the middle-aged man. Since we are already here, why not come down? We are more than willing to have this battle. However, stepping on your ship doesn't seem to be necessary, nor does it fulfill your original promise of a neutral site. The reality was that the fact that they could pick the location of this planet inherently made it not neutral to begin with. If they could set up teleportation stations here, who was to say that they hadn't set up anything else? Still, Lionel chose to attempt to compromise first. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. His thoughts from just a few days ago were still weighing on his mind. He didn't want to think of his enemies as others. He wanted to think of them as future subjects that he would one day subdue, people no different from himself. He was consciously trying to fight back against his own human nature to form in-groups and out-groups. As such, he couldn't just come in guns blazing just because someone was trying to play hardball in negotiations. But, what Lionel was going to find out very soon was the fact that sometimes it simply didn't matter how charismatic or nice you were. Oftentimes, logic was irrelevant as well. At a certain point, only those that were strong got a say in what could be deemed as reality and what couldn't be. And, as though to prove this, the middle-aged man's lip curled into a crooked sneer as though only a single half of his face worked properly. We have already laid out the requirements to end this war with as little bloodshed as possible, he said. However, if you don't want this olive branch, well, directly use this planet as a springboard to send out six-dimensional powerhouses into your galaxy. Then we'll end things our own way. At that moment, Lionel came to an understanding. They hadn't called them here to battle or even have these peace talks. They had been called here as a display of their strength and also as another slap to Earth's face. It was as though they were coddling Earth, showing them their trump cards like they didn't have the ability to find these things out on their own or understand them. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. And the most disgusting part of it was that they were correct. So, let me get this straight. You made up a bogus rule you thought we would be stupid enough to believe actually existed. You then made us teleport to this so-called neutral ground. And yet, instead of this neutral ground being the location of battle you asked for, you want us to teleport again so that we can go to your spaceship? Milan spoke without a care for courtesy. Usually, with Lionel and Noah taking the helm as princes of Earth, it wasn't the turn of others to speak. But, having been following Lionel for so long, a man who didn't really care about such strict hierarchy, Milan never hesitated to speak his mind, even in the face of these people. He was already infuriated at this point. These people, did they really think that they were stupid? The reason they had come here despite knowing that this prisoner competition was bogus was to prove that they had nothing to fear. Even if it was one-on-one battles, who cared? Since when were the people of Earth afraid of anything of the sort? But now they were very clearly taking it too far. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The middle-aged man's bronze eyeball spun, landing on Milan. Without a word, a formless pressure shot outward, forcing Milan to retreat explosively. Even one of his energy shields imploded on contact, not being able to withstand even a single surge of aura. Before anyone could react, Milan had already been forced backward dozens of meters. Tell your barking dog to watch his mouth. It's already beneath me to waste my time here. This isn't a negotiation. You either do it, or you face the consequences. Lionel's smile slowly faded. Chapter 1042. On the back of the junior starship, several groups of individuals stood. It became clear after some observations that they mainly fell into 4 categories. There were the unit of the Radix Midas families, then there came the Umbra, Rain, and even the Flora family. Despite their status as lifelong enemies, the Flora family had still come together with the Radix Midas families. It was clear that benefits were placed above all things when it came to these large families. Though there was some tension in the air, it wasn't anything these noblemen and women hadn't experienced countless times before. What was a gathering of noble families without millennia of pent-up grudges and never-ending revenge stories? At this moment, though, they all stood with cocktails and drinks in their hands, laughing and amused expressions on their faces as they gazed down toward the planet below. It was definitely a good choice to send Roxanne to go and make our stance clear. Look at how much fun he's having down there. The one who spoke was a gorgeous middle-aged woman. She had sparkling blue eyes and cascading black hair. There was something about her that seemed particularly illusory even though she stood on the back of the junior starship just like the rest of them. This woman was the current head of the Rain family, Dolores Rain. My little brother has been a pain in my neck all his life. It's about time he put that talent of his to some use. The head of the Radix family, Averone Radix, laughed. He currently stood right by the head of the Midas family, a man of enormous stature with teeth shimmering like sharpened rubies, Cirrus Midas. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, the fools of Earth actually dared to capture one of my sons and yet were stupid enough to come here as though there could be negotiations after that. This is the first time I've met a fifth-dimensional world that actually dared to be so arrogant. My Flora family has been sorely lacking in elite spores recently. It'll be certain to teach them what fear and respect is. The head of the Flora family was a woman with breasts twice the size of her head. But this was also because she could be considered to be overweight. Her belly bulged beneath her green gown and her chest threatened to pop it at the seams. It was clear that even if she lost the extra weight, she would still be elite in that department. The trouble was that this was hardly enough to make up for other, odd features. Head Belize Florer had a head of hair constructed of dark green vines. They appeared to be somewhat slimy on first glance as they were constantly exuded an odd viscous liquid that released a smell even more pungent than Head Cirrus sulfur breath. This smell was akin to concentrated cut grass, making it difficult to breathe. If that was it, it might still be acceptable. But Head Belize also had a spider lily growing out of her forehead and its roots were visible beneath her skin. It made one's spine tingle watching the roots pulse every so often, sucking in her blood from nourishment. For a family of supposed tree lovers and huggers, the Flora family was seemed to be the scariest of them all. If they were aware of exactly what elite spores were, this conclusion would be even more set in stone. The final head was, of course, of the Umbra family, Xylem Umbra. However, neither he, nor the youths to his back, spoke a single word. It seemed like unlike Radley's, the remaining members of the Umbra family matched their pale skin with stoicism and quiet. Isn't it because they're fools that we have to lay it out so plainly for them? Dolores chortled. We clearly only sent the younger generation after them as a sign of good faith and a form of taking a step back as the strong bullying the weak, but they actually took this as being our own weakness. Since they don't appreciate kindness, well, show them something else entirely, then. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Averone, it'll be best if your brother lets a few of them escape, but as punishment I think about half of them should die. What do you think? I agree. Belize supported Dolores. I would say to kill them all, but we still need to get the young ones back. Averone chuckled. There's no need to worry, Roxanne knows what to do. I think Earth actually sent 2 of its princes here as well, we might as well capture them both too. Fools. Belize sneered. They really think we haven't sent anyone in the 6th dimension because we can't, when in reality it's because who would pay such a heavy price to crush an ant? The youths behind the 5 heads all held an undisguised contempt in their eyes. So what if Earth had potential? It was ultimately just that, potential. When in the face of a higher dimensional world, what chance did they stand? On the barren planet, Lionel looked back toward Milan, who had been forced to retreat. At that moment, the young man who had been protecting Lionel all his life had a trickle of blood running down his lips and dripping from his chin. There was something especially sharp about that red color in Lionel's eyes currently. It was as though he could only see the whole world through shades of it and nothing else. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, barking dog? Lionel said lightly. That's right, did I not speak clearly enough for you? Roxanne's sneer deepened. Do you need me to repeat it a bit louder for you? Keep your barking dog on a leash or else I'll leash him for you. The youths of Earth suddenly flared up. Many of them knew Milan well, as they had been fighting together for years before Lionel returned. This sort of humiliation wasn't something they would stand for, however the strength of Roxanne was completely out of their expectations. They found it difficult even to stand near him. However, even as their tempers flared, the 2 princes, Noah and Lionel, only seemed to get calmer. I see. I don't think I care anymore. Lionel said lightly. Don't care? That's the right idea. Dogs should be dogs, what need is there to care for them? Roxanne's next words couldn't help but pause when Lionel turned back to meet his gaze. At that moment, the twin oppression of the princes bore down, causing the wind in the surroundings to turn heavy. Sometimes being nice is just a waste of time. I wonder if your head would make your galaxies understand? Lionel's voice had become akin to a reaper's. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _the website. Chapter 1043. Roxanne's smiling expression became even, a murderous aura coming off of him before the smile returned. This time, however, it seemed particularly bloody despite not having the slightest tinge of red associated with it. What did you just say to me? The aura of a quasi-6-dimensional existence rose into the skies, rippling waves of earth spreading outward, threatening to send the youths before him flying into the distance. He had decided, he would thoroughly humiliate them all. Only then would he kill half and send the other half crawling back to Earth. Who did they think they were to challenge the dignity of a 6th-dimensional world? Those within higher dimensions were the gods of those below. This wasn't a simple barrier separating people, it might as well have been a chasm separating species. If you were from a lower dimension, you were nothing more than an ant. This was the way of the dimensional verse. The idea of a 5th-dimensional world challenging the authority of a 6th-dimensional one was unheard of. And Roxanne would make sure that it remained that way. After this day, Earth wouldn't dare to raise its head up again. Noah. Lionel spoke just as lightly, his hair and clothing billowing beneath Roxanne's strength. Yes. I'm going to kill him. Okay. Lionel's foot raised. Just when it began to descend, he vanished, crossing the already short distance between him and Roxanne. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience up above, The heads were speechless before Belize erupted into laughter. They really overestimate themselves. This makes things easier. Now no one can say we bullied the weak, it's clear these fools who attacked first. The others' heads remained silent, but the look in their eyes painted a picture that couldn't have been more clear. However, their expressions changed when Lionel reappeared. A man donning silver armor appeared before Roxanne, his twin-bladed spear sweeping through the air with an eerily silent momentum. It was as though everywhere it passed by, it would be spliced into two. There was nothing that could obstruct its path and even less that could force it to halt. Roxanne's pupils constricted. He could feel the strength behind Lionel's strike, and it somewhat surprised him. But, it was nowhere near enough to force him into a corner. He raised a hand, his radix cube actually appearing, something that made his brother's gaze narrow. For Roxanne to take out his radix cube to face a junior, this was definitely out of their expectations. It was clear that they might have miscalculated a small measure. However, even then, they felt that this was good. If Roxanne wasn't underestimating his opponent, this would only end swifter. Roxanne's radix cube shimmered, adhering to his palm and coating to fit it. He struck out toward Lionel's strike, but what happened next was only further out of his expectations. For seasons. Bang! An eruption of universal force rocked the skies. Rotating artistic conceptions fused and diffused around Lionel, each forming a gorgeous image in the skies that gave the barren planet some character. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _ the website. Summer. Radiant core. The images shifted and grew brighter, a singular core of silver red less than a quarter the size of Lionel's head forming. It appeared between Lionel's spear blade and Roxanne's bronze palm, leaving a sickening crunching sound in its wake. Roxanne's eyes widened, a shrill cry leaving his lips. He could feel the force of his radix cube being distorted. And, even worse, there was a strong radiation and heat searing his skin to it. In the blink of an eye, not only had his hand shattered, but it had also gained a coating of molten metal. He retreated explosively, his mind going blank. This was his radix cube. How could it possibly be so fragile? It was designed for battle. It was only at that moment that Roxanne noticed the weapon in Lionel's hand. As a force crafter, it only took him a single glance. Quasi-silver? Roxanne didn't get much time to think when he realized that someone was actually behind him. Noah had appeared with his enormous saber. It rested on his shoulder, his gaze remaining just as placid as Lionel's own. An eruption of universal force surged out of him, the skies beginning to twinkle with flashing meteors, radiant moons, gorgeous worlds and sparkling stars. Like this, Lionel and Noah split the battlefield in two. On side was a paradise of the skies, the other was a paradise of the earth. A clash of the greater dimensional verse and the simplicity of the seasons. It was the kind of gorgeous painting that deserved to be immortalized. Noah swung down. Unlike Lionel's silent strike, his resounded like rumbling mountains. The air quaked and the ground beneath his feet split. Visit. For a better user experience, damn it. Roxanne was infuriated. He had been caught off guard by Lionel and now he was suddenly being pincered by two brats. Did they really think that he was a pushover? Roxanne brought down a strong chop midway up his forearm, slicing his own hand and wrist off. The radix cube fell to the ground along with his flesh. But, just before it hit Earth, it rebounded as though it had a mind of its own, shooting up into the air again. Roxanne shot out his bloody stump as his bronze eyeball rotated. A laser shot out from it and toward Lionel. At the same time, the radix cube morphed despite some of its internal components being melted. It reformed an enormous palm, replacing Roxanne's missing hand. With quick actions, Roxanne spun back toward Noah, slamming a palm of spinning gears toward his saber. Bang! A surge of force clashed between the two. Having been forced to attack in a hurry, Roxanne was only able to gather up enough strength to match Noah evenly. Complete cycle of the heavenly body realm. Roxanne's pupils constricted to an absolute extreme before his expression changed. That's impossible, Rotsan couldn't finish his thought, his force surging as he sent out an opposite palm toward his back. He didn't know how Lionel could have possibly managed to deal with his laser so quickly, but he didn't have time to think. Winter. Withering snowfall. No. Visit. For a better user experience, a spurt of blood shot into the sky, an arm spinning about in the air beneath the fountain of crimson. Chapter 1044. Rotsan's shock reached an untold level. He was certain that he had done enough to block Lionel, whether that be his laser or the subsequent attack. But he had somehow lost his arm. That should have been impossible. His laser was a hidden measure and carried the impact of a Tier 9 expert, not to mention a speed that dwarfed even a quasi-6-dimensional existence. To make matters worse, his strike should have been more than enough to deal with a Tier 1 expert like Lionel, who had only grasped the Four Seasons realm. But, to his shock, not only was Lionel's Four Seasons realm far more powerful than any Rotsan had ever come across before, but his winter artistic conception was actually able to corrode his force. The result was the force Rotsan prepared as a counter being rendered useless and his arm flying off as a result. To Rotsan's horror, Lionel's assault didn't come to an end, nor did Noah take even a step back. Their oppressive auras rose in unison, burying Rotsan's own beneath their might. Rotsan dove to the side, running from Lionel's blade and trying to slip Noah's in such a way that the two princes would be forced to clash. However, it was right at that moment that a new oppression descended. Lionel's gaze was cold, the pale violet hues of his irises dancing with a darker and darker light. He held out his silver dual-bladed spear, the air around it trembling. Lionel had had this spear in his possession for a very long time. But he had never been able to use its domain. Every attempt he made resulted in the spear fighting back, its disdain for him being almost palpable. However, things were different now. A buzzing sound appeared from thin air, the spear continuing to tremble. Duality. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel and Noah's speeds suddenly broke through a barrier. Realizing the change, Noah no longer hesitated, his body weight increasing explosively as a sheen of diamond coated his skin. His saber doubled in size as he swung down. Rotsan's expression warped. He tried to retreat again, but for some reason he found that his speed had plummeted. His bronze eyeball spun, a sudden realization hitting him. The percentage of his speed he lost was exactly how much Lionel and Noah gained, simply split between the two of them. He was a crafter. Picking out the subtle details and completing quick calculations was something he had been doing all his life. He realized then that there was no way this was a coincidence. Was this the ability of Lionel? How could he have such a powerful ability? The exchange between the three grew heated, Rotsan throwing out everything he had to survive. But the delicate instruments of his radix cube had been destroyed by Lionel right at the outset of the battle, leaving him with only the most crude of his crafts. He realized that Lionel had planned this from the very beginning, driving him into a corner from the start and ensuring that he never got to use his full strength as a quasi-6-dimensional existence. His actions had seemed reckless, but they were calculated to an extreme. Rotsan wanted to shout this out at the top of his lungs, to warn his brother and the others of what they might have to face, but he was so suffocated by the two princes that he couldn't even find the space to take a breath. On the ship above, an eerie silence had fallen. Averon Radix's veins popped along his forehead, the aura of a 6-dimensional existence threatening to shatter the space around him. The creaking of the ship grew more and more violent. Head, I will go. A young man stepped out from the Radix family. He knew that if the head could go, he already would have. Unfortunately, even though the junior starship seemed to be hovering just above the planet, the reality was that they were literally a world away. Crossing into a 5th-dimensional fold of reality took a lot out of a 6th-dimensional existence. By the time he succeeded, the battle would be over. Go. Averon practically growled. Visit. For a better user experience, sabers, spears and palms crossed and clashed. Rotsan's body was beaten and bloodied, barely using the reserves of his strength to hold on. But it was very quickly becoming apparent that he wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. All around him, the youths of Earth watched on coldly, a pride blooming in their hearts as they watched their two princes drive such a powerful man to his death. Who said that they were weak? That they were dogs? The billowing violet aura hanging around Lionel only seemed to grow thicker while the emerald of Noah's gaze grew brighter. Noah's saber doubled in size again. Rotsan swung out his bronzed palm in retaliation, but his attack speed was suddenly halved while Noah's accelerated even after seemingly already reaching its top speed. Fuck. I'll go all out with you. A billow bronze force shot up around Rotsan's body, causing his skin to quickly turn metallic, all sorts of hidden gadgets within his body piercing outside and coating him from head to toe. But, if this would really change the outcome of the battle, he would have already done it. In that moment, Lionel appeared to his back, his spear arching upward and taking with it Rotsan's other arm just as it rose up to block Noah's strike. Rotsan's expression became ferocious, his teeth becoming bronzed as he bit down toward the blade. But, Noah's wrist shifted, hacking at Rotsan's waist. The sound of metal shearing metal resounded, Noah's saber getting stuck halfway through Rotsan's body. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience horror lit the latter's gaze as he fell to his knees, blood and fluid oil falling out from him. Even nearing his death, he had no idea how Lionel had rendered so many of his abilities so useless. It was only after a small metal spirit wiggled its way out of his wounded hip that he came to understand. Metal spirit. Lionel and Noah stood over Rotsan's kneeling figure, their expression unmoved and indifferent. If it wasn't for their slightly hurried breathing, it would be difficult to believe that they were human. Lionel raised his spear. Right now, he had no intention of being diplomatic nor merciful. He wasn't a fool. He understood exactly what would have happened had he and Noah not been strong enough today. Stop. A figure was forming in a not too far off teleportation platform, the very one they had planned to use to bring them to their ship. However, this figure was horrified to find that his body was still illusory as though caught between two states. Lionel swept a gaze over. As if he would allow reinforcements to casually come and go as they pleased. Did he really look like a fool to them? His spear didn't pause for even a moment. I swear if that spear falls, you'll regret it. The moment these words were said, a crimson light lit Lionel's gaze. The two most important things in his life, the mantra he had lived by since he was a child, was respect and persistence. What he hated the most was being disrespected. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience SHUU. SSSS. Lionel's spear swept through Rotsan's neck, a fountain of blood following suit. Then, he pointed it toward the illusory figure. As many as you send is as many as I will kill. Chapter 1045. Noah watched as Lionel's spear descended and he made no move to stop it. In the past, Noah had put in a lot of effort trying to match the status quo. He became the perfect prince, followed all of the rules, and was in lockstep with everything that was expected of him. If the himself of just 4 years ago was in this same position, he may very well have stepped out to stop Lionel before they escalated the situation beyond the realms of return. However, after experiencing the battle with Terrain, watching his close friends fall one after another while his own individual power seemed completely unable to stop it all, something within him had shifted. He had worked harder in the last 4 years than anyone, but the greatest change was definitely in his demeanor. Outwardly, it seemed as though he was still the same person. But inwardly, he was a caged beast lashing out against his chains, waiting to be released. So, when Lionel said that he would kill this man and even called out to him, Noah didn't hesitate to step forward for even a single moment. He was the prince of the Ascension Empire. All the youths here were people he was duty-bound to protect with his life. A slight against them was a slap across his face. They wanted to use them as an example? To kill and capture them as a warning to Earth? Well, in that case, they could taste his blade. The youth stuck within the teleportation platform fumed with rage. However, after speaking his final words, Lionel no longer paid attention to him, walking back toward Milan. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Are you alright? Milan gave Lionel a cheeky, yet bloodied grin. It seemed he wasn't quite aware that his teeth were soaked with blood at this moment. Milan tried to speak, but he ended up coughing. Lionel frowned deeply, placing a hand on Milan's shoulder. When he used his internal sight to see the state of Milan's body, the coldness in Lionel's gaze grew deep. Milan might have been standing now, but that was only because his pride hadn't allowed him to fall. As prideful as Lionel was, his brothers were just the same. It could be said that there wasn't a single one of Milan's inner organs that wasn't damaged. In fact, maybe if it wasn't because of his skilled application of his energy shield, the result would have been worse. Both James and Milan shared the same ability. However, when James awakened, he was grade while Milan was C-grade initially. As both matured, the gap between them increased exponentially. After seeing James' application of his energy shield, Milan realized that he was far behind in not just talent, but ingenuity as well. So, he began to experiment with changing the form of his energy shield, and the result of this actually saved his life this time. Lionel seemed to realize this as well because his Dream Path ability hadn't computed this progression for Milan either. Of course, that was because he had yet to use Dream Path again since he returned, but it was the reality nonetheless. Calming his emotions, Lionel began to heal Milan. Only after the latter was back in perfect condition did he look toward the youth who was currently still stuck between teleportation states. No matter how hard he tried, he could neither go forward nor backward. At this point, rather than his usual bravado, he had silently begun to feel fear. If Lionel had already killed one of them, why not one more? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Bang! Lionel clenched a fist, the space around the teleportation platform warping and shattering. No. Lionel was completely unmoved. Let's head back. Lionel looked toward everyone before landing on Noah. I'm sure that their attacks will be more furious now, but I can also tell that you're all dissatisfied as well. Make sure they feel that dissatisfaction. Lionel waved a hand, activating the teleportation platform they had used to come here. However, everyone's gaze was on Lionel, who was clearly not coming with them. I won't be far behind you all, I just have some things to finish first. Lionel said with a smile. Even though his smile looked just the same as it always did, for some reason, it felt especially cold at this moment. It was only now they realized just how easy it was for Lionel to fake this smile, and it made them wonder. How many other times had he done exactly that? Visit. For a better user experience, the youths all vanished, returning to Earth's fold of reality and leaving no one but Lionel and Roxanne's corpse on the barren planet. Lionel sent a gaze up toward the junior starship looming on the planet's horizon before directly ignoring them and moving toward the decapitated corpse. Little Tolly bobbed upon Lionel's shoulder, looking on with excitement. This was the first time the little guy had gotten to participate in a battle so directly, and it was clearly more than just a little excited. However, Lionel let it have its fun. After all, if it wasn't for little Tolly, the battle wouldn't have ended nearly as simply. That moment when Lionel used his Radiant Core artistic conception, Roxanne thought that it was it that melted the core component's radix cube, when in reality it was a clever and stealth application of a small piece of little Tolly's body. In a panic, Roxanne cut his forearm off, but that was the perfect mask to allow little Tolly to sneak into his body. Under any other circumstances, little Tolly burrowing through your flesh would have alerted you to something being off due to the searing pain, but because Roxanne had expected pain from his forearm since he cut it off, he hadn't realized that anything was wrong. By the time he understood that something had to be off, little Tolly had already reached the metallic parts hidden within his body and began to destroy them all. In that state, since they were all his artificial body pieces, Roxanne hadn't felt any pain at all and only realized something was wrong when he tried to activate their mechanisms. Lionel wasn't under any illusions that he could defeat a quasi-six-dimensional existence, especially not one from a far more talented galaxy than the Milky Way. So, he felt no shame in using such hidden tactics for victory. The Radix family only had themselves to blame for daring to use metals in a battle with him. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel squatted down by Roxanne's body and shot a fist through his skull. With one swift motion, he ripped out the latter's bronze eyeball. At that moment, the fury of the Radix family had definitely reached a peak. Chapter 1046. As though he hadn't mutilated the corpse enough, Lionel's finger twitched, sending little Tolly barreling into Roxanne's now empty eye socket. At that moment, Roxanne's body began to deflate, his skeleton losing its shape and his flesh slumping to the ground. By the end of it, the normal bone that was left was nearly none at all, leaving a grotesque flesh suit behind. Little Tolly shot out of Roxanne's eye socket. But, this time, the little guy was followed by a long snaking chain of bronzed metals. It was clear that these precious metals represented all of the hidden components within Roxanne's body. Obviously, Roxanne hadn't undergone just a small bit of modification. Unfortunately, when facing Lionel, he hadn't been able to bring out even a fraction of this strength. He had been forced to use his raw quasi-six-dimensional force, but this was clearly something that he was very much not used to doing. The end result was him being hounded to death. There are some six-dimensional metals in here, though the chains of metals looked homogeneous due to the fact they all shared the same color. Lionel realized immediately that this wasn't the case. It only seemed like that because of the odd bronze force that the Radix family used. But, the properties of these metals were clearly very much different. If Roxanne had been able to deploy the mechanisms constructed of these six-dimensional metals. Lionel shook his head. His caution had bore fruit this time, and it alerted him to just how much he couldn't underestimate these higher dimensional worlds. Maybe in some ways, they deserved their arrogance. But, Lionel would make them pay for it nonetheless. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. It'll put you to good use. This was the first time Lionel had set eyes on a six-dimensional metal, which was funny considering he had seen a seventh-dimensional one with his memory organ. However, he was still very much in tune with how valuable this could be. Lionel put the six-dimensional metals away and let little Tolly devour all the fifth-dimensional ones. Then, he turned his focus to the rolling eyeball in his hand. This eyeball had been set to self-destruct upon Roxanne's death. But, due to little Tolly, the chain reaction mechanism linked to Roxanne's heart had been destroyed before it could be deployed. As a result, the eyeball managed to survive. This alone made Lionel realize that there should probably be something valuable about this eyeball. Just as Lionel was about to look into it more deeply, his gaze narrowed. Bloop blurp asterisk little Tolly began to make noises different from its usual before it expelled a fog of bronze force. In fact, to describe it as such did a disservice to just how large the quantity of it was. The force shot out like a cyclone from the little guy, quickly forming a huge cloud formation in the skies that blanketed hundreds of meters of sky. Lionel's gaze narrowed before his finger tapped the necklace hanging from his neck. Visit. For a better user experienced the gold-scaled koi fish, no longer daring to disobey Lionel, reacted quickly. A large suction force manifested from within it, sucking in the entire bronze cloud in the blink of an eye. Lionel still didn't know much about this bronze force as Libly had refused to tell him much of anything. However, he could find out on his own and even ask the dictionary to analyze it for him. So, he wouldn't miss this chance. Clearly, this bronze force wasn't exactly a metal force, or else little Tolly would have been able to absorb it. There had to be something different about it. After reaching this conclusion, Lionel actually chose to forego checking the eyeball for now. He had been working under the assumption that whatever was inside was a secret of the Radix family, so it wouldn't particularly matter if he opened it up under their watch or not. But, what if it wasn't? What if it was something Roxanne wanted to hide from his family as well? If that was the case, then opening it here would just be Lionel exposing something he could have otherwise kept a secret. So, he chose to head back first. Looking at the disfigured corpse beneath his feet, Lionel waved a palm and sent out a ball of radiant fire force. The corpse was instantly engulfed and quickly burnt to ash. Without looking back, Lionel took a step into the teleportation platform and vanished. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience up above a silence reigned. In fact, the only sound that could be heard was the gasping breath of a familiar young man who kneeled on all fours, his gaze flickering between fear and rage. Just before the teleportation platform was shattered by Lionel, the young man was forcefully pulled out by Averone, saving his life. Now, a deep-seated humiliation was beginning to grow within his heart. He wanted nothing more than to tear Lionel limb from limb. Averone's expression had become placid. Watching Lionel mutilate his brother's corpse despite knowing full well that they were all watching had brought him over a peak. He was more infuriated now than any Flora family member had ever made him. To make matters worse, Lionel had gotten his hands on his brother's eye. This wasn't just a small loss for the Radix family, it was possible that all their secrets would be exposed. The structure of the Radix family's head system was split into two. There was the patriarch and then there was his right-hand man. The right-hand man, known as the Radix Shield, controlled the family in the shadows while the patriarch controlled it in the light. The duty of the Radix Shield was to maintain order, protect the family, and most importantly, protect the family secrets. As for how a six-dimensional family could give such an important task to a quasi-six-dimensional existence, the truth was that even Averone wasn't confident in defeating his younger brother despite the gap in their strength. The reason for this was because of all of Roxanne's powerful hidden mechanisms. Roxanne was effectively their trump card. He wasn't in the sixth dimension, so he could freely enter their fold of reality and his combat prowess was on the level of them as heads. But now, not only was he gone, but so were the secrets he protected. Visit. For a better user experience. I want all the people of Earth dead by the end of this month. Chapter 1047. Averone's voice dripped with a barely concealed fury. The junior starship shook and quaked, the seams threatening to burst. However, if a starship was so easy to destroy, it wouldn't have such a name to begin with. We can't go that far. The words cut through all of Averone's momentum despite its softness. To the shock of the heads, it was actually Xylem, the silent head of the Umbra family, who spoke, shutting down Averone's thoughts before they could even be put into action. What did you just say? Averone growled. I'm not a fan of repeating myself, you heard me just fine. In case you've forgotten, Earth is the subject of interest for countless powerful existences. As much as you look down on them, those that have a vested stake in what happens to Earth going into the future are the very same individuals that would look down on you. The only advantage we have over these existences is proximity. Don't let your overinflated ego blind you to that fact. If you dare to commit mass genocide, even setting aside the fact that Shield Cross stars would never allow such a thing to happen, even if you somehow manage to succeed, there will be hell to pay. I agreed to participate in this war to claim a small piece of this fertile land for my Umbra family. I didn't come to kill or maim. I would advise that you all wake up and realize the true nature of the situation that we're in. We're nothing more than mice nibbling at the edges of meat prepared for lions. The more you pretend as though you're the lion, the greater you'll suffer in the future. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. If you want revenge, go and seek it. But if you dare to step over the bounds of reason, they'll be the first to stop you. From beginning to end, the Umbra family head's words were even and unhurried, and yet it simultaneously felt as though there wasn't an opportunity to interrupt him at all. His momentum was smooth and consistent, his silent confidence weighing far more than any false sense of bravado ever could. Despite the fact he was calling himself a mouse, it still felt like something far more profound than just that. Xylem's words seemed to wake everyone out of their delusions, even Averone to some extent. That was right, they had the advantage of proximity and they could take a hold of it. But, if they went too far and compromised the food of the true giants, it would be they who suffered first long before Earth did. In addition, as the police force of the universe, there were many heinous acts that Shield Cross stars would never allow. Something like genociding a whole world of people was most definitely on that list. If their families were placed on a list of evildoers, it wouldn't even matter what gains they made here because it would all be stripped away very soon. Averon looked off into the distance, his hands still clasped behind his back. His fury was still buried deep within his heart. They had been breathing in their own bullshit for so long that they actually believed it. The reason they didn't dare to send six-dimensional existences after Earth wasn't to avoid bullying the weak, it was because they didn't want to incur the wrath of those higher powers. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. They were still walking on eggshells when they came here. They were trying to probe out the bottom lines of those organizations, which was why they hadn't even tried to attack Earth directly and only aimed for the periphery. Wasn't this exactly why Emperor Fox would call them cowards? Averon took a deep breath before suddenly closing his eyes. When they opened again, they reflected the same calm they had before. But, this time, he was truly calm. He had experienced too much life to lose his cool for an extended period of time. Xylem. Averon said calmly. Yes? What is your end goal? As I said, I don't like to repeat myself. Xylem had made himself clear. He just wanted to carve out a small piece of these fertile lands for his Umbra family. Nothing more, nothing less. Greed was the bane of human existence. Visit. For a better user experience, I understand, however I still need to know your bottom line. How far are you willing to go? Or how far are you willing to cower? Averon's words were clearly provocative, but Xylem didn't seem to care in the slightest. As long as Earth isn't eradicated, I'm willing to go as far as necessary. Xylem's stance was also clear. If he didn't want to take any risks at all, he wouldn't have come to this battle. However, he was obviously willing to do so, he just knew that wiping out the people of Earth would be way too far. Then are you willing to push our plans forward? Do you dare? Xylem fell into silence. The original plan of the families came in 2 steps. The first step was to claim a strong foothold in Earth's fold of reality when it entered the 5th dimension. The second step would occur when Earth entered the 6th. When that happened, they would no longer be restricted and could use that foothold they had earned to expand and carve out a territory for themselves. According to even the most conservative predictions, Earth's 6th-dimensional fold of reality would swallow the entire Milky Way. In the most aggressive, it might even encroach on their nearby galaxies. Knowing this, the families were ready well ahead of time. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. If they pushed their plans forward, they would be throwing caution to the wind and effectively strangling Earth by bringing out their full power ahead of time. Even if this plan didn't go as far as to eradicate the people of Earth, what it did do was put them in a stranglehold they would have little chance of getting out of. To them, this wasn't a risk that involved Earth. As things stood, Earth wasn't prepared to deal with a full-scale attack from 6th-dimensional worlds. Their loss was inevitable. Rather, this was a risk that involved the reaction of those powers. Did they dare to do this or not? Ah. Xylem let out an odd sound. Finally some real backbone, it's about time. Why would I not dare? Chapter 1048. While the 6th-dimensional families likely believed that Lionel had returned to Earth, the truth was that Lionel was currently streaking across the stars in the segmented cube. As for his destination, it was a branch of the Force Crafters Guild. Lionel hadn't forgotten the chance the Golden Path branch had given him, and he planned to cash in on that chance right this moment. Although Lionel's father disliked the Force Crafting Guild for some reason, Lionel doubted that problem stemmed from these lower-level branches, so he formed relationships without worrying about it. When Lionel felt that he was on the right trajectory, he allowed the segmented cube to cruise and pulled out the bronze eyeball. Just looking at it now, Lionel could tell that it was intricately structured. In fact, it was no less complicated than the inner workings of Roxanne's radix cube. Remembering how violently Libly had reacted to even the idea of restarting your radix cube, Lionel chuckled to himself. It almost felt like Roxanne had indeed restarted, it was just that he hid it in a different form. There's a lot of hidden mechanisms in this eye, and I would be stupid to think that there aren't other lines of defenses. If I take a wrong step, it would probably self-destruct. But, could it be more complicated than the memory ore? Lionel highly doubted that, and he was correct. He sunk his internal sight into the eyeball and quickly deciphered its inner workings. Metal doesn't act like this. It's almost like a living organism rather than a dead object. This has to be related to the bronze force. Lionel realized that the inner workings were indeed not as complex as the memory organ. However, even though it was less complex, Lionel was still at a bit of a loss on how to open it up. It felt like Lionel had a perfect lock-picking set for the memory ore, but for this eyeball, even though the mechanisms were simpler, he was missing the appropriate tools. Lionel knew that if he acted rashly, he would end up losing the eye entirely. Lionel narrowed his eyes. With a flip of his palm, the bronze eye vanished and was replaced by a shimmering bronze crystal. There hadn't been enough force to form a pure crystal, but there had been enough for the segmented cube to form a normal crystal. This should be more than enough for the dictionary to analyze. Lionel thought for a moment, trying to decide what the best question to ask was before he settled on one. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, what type of force category does this force fall under? Ping, replying to Seed, this force falls under two categories, life elemental and limit breaking. Lionel's brows shot up. Is breaking force also a type of limit breaking? Lionel had gotten so swept up in the war that he forgot about the tentacle womb. He didn't have the luxury to care about it. But now that the Seed had actually said something like this, it clicked. Ping, breaking force is a name that the limit breaking type goes by. Lionel was suddenly endlessly intrigued. So maybe this breaking force wasn't as rare as he thought, or maybe it simply came in all sorts of shapes and sizes, not to mention qualities. But, to think that the bronze force truly wasn't related to metal forces at all. Lionel had already guessed this, but even in his most extreme conclusions he had thought that it could be routed back to Earth force in some way, shape or form. Clearly, though, this wasn't the case. What is the strictest definition of limit breaking? Ping, visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, to twist the fundamental governing laws of force, what happens when bronze force is applied to metals? Ping, the dictionary took a pause. It was the sort of pause that usually happened when a recording was about to go live. But, to Lionel's shock, there was no recording this time. That meant that there was only one explanation: the dictionary needed time to compute the answer. This truth shocked Lionel maybe more than anything else. He had never seen the dictionary need time to do anything. Clearly, this was taking a lot out of it. Replying to Seed, there is a 97% chance that the inorganic metal would gain organic properties. The answer was simple and to the point, but it left Lionel speechless. What kind of organic properties? Ping, there was another long pause, but this time, even after 10 minutes, there was no answer. This made Lionel realize something. Don't list all the possibilities, just give me a general answer. Lionel tried to throw out this lifeline to the dictionary. Even though its answers were usually as specific as possible, he hoped it had the ability to make an exception. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, replying to Seed, the organic properties would depend on the metal. A general property would be that the metal would become an extension of the body the bronze force originated from and become like an additional limb. Hearing this response, Lionel's gaze glowed fiercely. Even the Morales family lineage factor couldn't do such a thing. However, there was something nagging at Lionel. It felt like the Radix family was misusing their own lineage factor. Sure, this bronze force had such an effect on metals, but what about its effect on other things? There was nothing about this force that made it so that it could only be used in this way. Lionel fell into deep thought. Within the Ascension Palace's gardens, Emperor Fox sat in silent meditation as usual. He was looking younger and younger by the day. From an old man, in just a few years he already seemed to be back in his 40s. He exuded a handsome charm that could make countless women swoon and had a maturity and forcefulness to his aura that demanded respect. It was the kind of demeanor that allowed him to speak as outlandishly as he usually did, and yet still no one dared to slight him. Daddy. At that moment, a sweet voice drifted into Emperor Fox's ears. It held a delicate melody to it that even dwarfed Anya's own. It came with the kind of richness Anya simply didn't have because she lacked the age and refinement. Emperor Fox's eyes opened, his expression softening when he heard this voice. Little girl, you finished? I am coming back now. I will return to the Luxnix family very soon. Can you help send my little lion over? His mother misses him. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Chapter 1049. Hearing his daughter's words, Emperor Fox became silent for a moment. He wasn't surprised at the sudden voice. As the owner of the world spirit, the princess had all sorts of abilities that only grew as Earth became more powerful. Something like this was easy to accept. Emperor Fox's silence had nothing to do with this. You're still so stubborn. The Luxnix family should have been destroyed a long time ago. Emperor Fox said lightly. You know Mom would never allow that. She lacks backbone and determination. Why else would she have been stuck at her current strength for so long? She allows emotion to interfere with what should be done. Such a family should have been wiped from existence for daring to touch my grandson. Those who are responsible have already paid. Though the princess said this, her voice seemed to have lost some of its cheeriness. In fact, her tone had become even colder than her father's, but it was clear that this rage wasn't aimed toward the emperor. Visit. For a better user experience, even she doesn't believe that. Emperor Fox's tone likewise became colder. Do you think the events of back then could have happened with just the nod of one or two people? Even now they're reaping the benefits and relying on the foolish kindness of that woman and her hold on you. Alright, that's enough. That's still mother you're talking about. I would have less to complain about if my daughter returned home instead of going to that cesspool. The princess sighed. I still can't move freely. I've only been allowed to return to the Luxnix because it's that time in the cycle again, they're beginning to recruit. In fact, I had to apply to be here. They almost didn't let me, but Val came and wreaked some havoc. Emperor Fox smiled and shook his head. Of course this Val his daughter was so casually affectionately calling out the name of was his son-in-law Velasco Morales. For him to go and wreak havoc over there, it could only be said that his balls were big enough. I'm sure they're very excited about that. Emperor Fox replied. Dad, Miguel is just a child, he can't be blamed for this. No one is innocent. He is now benefiting from the sins of others and will likely continue to benefit. But, he is still the least of my issues. The entire Council of Elders should have been slaughtered. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Dad, Emperor Fox shook his head. Your usual temper has been watered down in this situation due to your mother's involvement. However, my grandson has grown into a very particular type of young man in your absence and his temper is worse than that of his parents and even his grandparents. If you really want him to go over to the Luxnix family right now, I can't promise that the peace your mother sacrificed so much to keep won't be destroyed within the year. He's been very unpredictable ever since that girl left him. The princess remained silent for a very long time until she suddenly registered her father's last sentence. Girl? Left my little lion? What wench is this? Emperor Fox closed an eye, the sudden outburst of his daughter hurting his ears. She had immediately gone from docile mediator to enraged lioness. If it wasn't for actions Emperor Fox took, the whole of Earth's fold of reality would be trembling right this very moment. Emperor Fox coughed lightly. Even with his temper he wouldn't get involved in the matters of children. However, his daughter clearly didn't care about this one bit. It even felt like she might truly ignore the rules of that place and go hunt that poor girl down right this very moment. It was obvious that she had no intention of asking what Lionel might have done or if he had done anything wrong at all. All she cared about was the final result. As far as she was concerned, any little girl who dared to choose a path opposing her son deserved to be punished. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience about this. Emperor Fox suddenly regretted bringing this matter up at all. Shouldn't you be more concerned about what will happen if he goes there? If his relationship with his grandmother is severed because of this, there will be nothing any of us can do. Emperor Fox was more clever this time and chose not to admit that Lionel also seemed to hate him as well. It had been too long since he spoke to his little girl and he had no intention of making her infuriated toward him too. At this point, his reasoning wouldn't matter. When a mother wanted to protect her son, she would turn even against her own father. This, Emperor Fox was absolutely certain of. Either way, he had been observing Lionel for a long time. There was a point where Lionel didn't even care about the life and death of his own mother because he had no memories of her. Of course, he wouldn't tell his daughter this either, or else who knew how she would react? At that point, because of what happened back then, it might be both Lionel and she who fell out with the Luxnix family completely. If not for that event, Lionel wouldn't have been forced to come to Earth and wouldn't have had to leave his mother's side before he was old enough to remember her. Trouble is that the same indifference Lionel had for his mother previously was likely the same indifference he currently had for his grandmother. If he was also to find out that it was her efforts that protected the perpetrators of something Emperor Fox was sure Lionel was furious about. Well, that young man truly loved to cause trouble, so the outcome was obvious. If Miguel didn't react appropriately to the situation, the efforts they made in saving him from Velasco as a child would all come to nothing if he just died at Lionel's hand anyway. As for Lionel's suffering at the hands of the Luxnix, Emperor Fox didn't even consider it. If Lionel really ended up like that, he would just disown him as a grandson. Visit. For a better user experience, unfortunately, Emperor Fox's diversion tactic didn't work. Who is this girl? Just one more chapter coming today. DKM. Chapter 1050. Lionel had no idea that his mother was currently speaking with his grandfather about such things, and he also had no idea that his grandfather actually knew so much about his life. It would be hard to tell how Lionel would react to such a thing. It was an odd coincidence, though. Lionel's mother might have contacted Lionel directly to tell him to go to the Luxnix family, but Lionel wasn't currently in Earth's fold of reality, so the princess hadn't been able to use her world spirit to find him and could only speak with Emperor Fox. But, maybe this was for the best. If Lionel had to be hounded by his mother about what happened with Aina, who knows how such a thing would end. This aside, the current Lionel was still thinking about Bronze Force, imagining the ways that it could be applied and used. According to the dictionary, Bronze Force reacted differently based on the metal it was targeting, but the fundamental truth was that it could give the inorganic characteristics of the organic. This was what allowed the radix to fuse their cubes into their bodies, presumably, and it should also be what allowed them to control the metals to form delicate structures. Under these conditions, the radix family should be quite good at creating crafts for themselves but lacking creating crafts for others. After all, it wasn't like they could give their Bronze Force to others to use. There was something else curious about this as well, and that was the close relationship between the Radix and Midas family. That must factor in somehow. However, Lionel couldn't really wrap his head around what was so special about their relationship and why they insisted on maintaining it generation after generation. From what Lionel understood, the Midas family was one with great fire affinity. But, he didn't know much else. He wasn't sure what could be so useful about this, especially since the crafting of the Radix family obviously didn't rely on fire. Visit. For a better user experience, this is just surface level stuff. But ultimately, if Bronze Force has such abilities when applied to metals, what else could it be applied to? If I had the ability to form Bronze Force of my own, could I add it to fire to give it life as well? What about light? The possibilities were endless. If the inanimate could be controlled by a person like it was another limb, just how powerful would that be? But, Lionel couldn't help but think back to Libley's aversion to starting another Radix cube. What if that was a taboo created for a reason? A taboo potentially related to a limitation of Bronze Force? Lionel shook his head. None of this mattered because Lionel ultimately didn't have the ability to produce bronze force. And, without a high enough concentration of this force to form a pure force crystal with natural force arts he could study, he couldn't draw a force art to accumulate it either. That said, the solution to this was simple. Blood force is very easy to accumulate, it just requires killing, and beasts tend to have it formed in large quantities. I can use Twinkling Lily to extract it and then pass it off to the koi fish. And now, I have a method of easily accumulating life and breaking force too. I just need to kill all the radix I come across. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Lionel's expression turned cold. Since the radix wanted to be his enemies, he would use them to upgrade his tentacle womb. The cold in Lionel's gaze slowly receded. What he needed was information, and this eyeball likely had much of what he needed within it. There was no way he could let it sit doing nothing, but he also couldn't rashly take action. Lionel stared at the bronze crystal in his palm. He wanted to take control of the energy within it, but he had no affinity with it. He could hardly budge it at all, let alone use it with enough deftness to dodge the traps of the bronze eyeball. Unless, Lionel suddenly took out the silver tablet. His reasoning was simple. He had a feeling that the silver tablet fell into the limit-breaking type as well, considering all of the things it could do. In fact, it was on a much higher plane than the bronze force was. At the same time, the silver tablet was a perfect medium. It was great at consuming, redirecting and controlling energy. In addition to this, it was very docile before Lionel and listened to his thoughts without reserve. Lionel even had a feeling that he was only scratching the surface of what this tablet was capable of, but that was a problem for another day. Good. This should work. Visit. For a better user experience using the silver tablet as a medium, the unmoving bronze force suddenly became very responsive. After a few tests, Lionel gave a confident nod and flipped his palm to reveal the bronze eyeball. Just like that, in not even a few minutes, a light click resounded as the mechanisms of the eyeball fell into silence. Nothing seemed to have changed, and the eyeball hadn't changed shape, but Lionel knew that everything was safe and clear now. So it's a spatial treasure, I see. Lionel's gaze glowed. It seemed that all of these mechanisms were put in place for the sake of hiding the spatial properties of this eyeball. But now that the protections were gone, a new world opened up to Lionel. So large, Lionel was shocked. Aside from the segmented cube, this was the largest inner space he had ever seen. In fact, it was an entire library and was at least 50 by 50 meters with a ceiling height of at least double that. The spatial treasures that Lionel was used to were at best 5 cubic meters large. But, he soon realized that this spatial treasure from a 6-dimensional world should probably be exactly this large. Plus, it wasn't like it could hold living things like the segmented cube could. That said, the state of Lionel's calm only lasted for a moment because Lionel was immediately shocked just a split second later. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. After a long pause, he grinned wildly. Chapter 1051. Lionel had expected something good the moment he saw the size of the hidden space within, but he had most definitely not expected anything so good. It was one thing if this ring carried all the secret techniques of the radix family. Though this would be interesting and a decent reference for Lionel, especially as he moved toward maybe one day soon starting on his second divine armor, it wouldn't be to the point that Lionel would react like this. Even though Lionel managed to take control of Roxanne's bronze force with the help of the silver tablet, it had to be understood that this didn't change the fact that bronze force was ultimately something Lionel could not use. The radix were able to use bronze force as an extension of themselves to make their radix cubes a part of their very being, almost like gaining another complex limb. However, because Lionel couldn't produce bronze force himself since he didn't share their lineage factor, he would never be able to replicate this feat without the ability to produce bronze force. Lionel wouldn't be able to make the metals his own. Even if Lionel stole from the radix and formed more bronze crystals like these, he would end up making objects that could act as extensions of others rather than him. Say for example he used Libli's bronze force, whatever object he changed would ultimately be hers to control. This was all to say that though Lionel was intrigued by the Radix family's crafting skill, it wasn't to the point that it would be life-changing to him. Ultimately, it was highly unlikely that any six-dimensional family would be able to match up to the knowledge the Morales family could provide, especially when it was remembered that the branch of the Force Crafters Guild itself viewed the Morales as a rival. So why was Lionel so excited? It could be summed up in one word: secrets. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Lionel had never expected that Roxanne was such an important individual. The information he held within his eye went beyond the scope of the Radix family but even touched on secrets of not only the Midas, but even their enemy and potential enemy families. This meant that not only did this library have the resulting espionage on the Midas family, but it also had in-depth information on the Umbra, Rain, and especially the Flora family. Even beyond that, there was a dense breakdown of the Milky Way and a half a dozen other galaxies in the general vicinity. Lionel could have never thought that such a thing would fall into his lap. What Lionel didn't know was that Roxanne was a contingency plan of the Radix family. This store of information was actually a copy of the main source. In case anything happened to one, there would always be the other. This was why Roxanne set things up to so confidently destroy all of this valuable information. But in the end, how could the Radix ever prepare for a day where their Radix shield would run into the wielder of a metal spirit whose combat prowess was low enough in relation to him to warrant such a sneaky use of the natural treasure? The irony of it all was that if Lionel was powerful enough to crush Roxanne without such underhanded means, Roxanne's plan would have gone smoothly and this information would have never landed in Lionel's hands. It seems my luck isn't too bad. Lionel grinned. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. This information was what he lacked the most. It was also one of the reasons he didn't dare to make large moves in the Milky Way. Well, that and the fact his foundation was sorely lacking. He hadn't even convinced the Oryx to be on his side yet. But now, things were different. For the first time, Lionel was actually thankful that someone had tried to kill him. Lionel began to pore over the information instantly, his internal sight working at a near unconscious speed. Compared to what he was going to do at his destination, every bit of this information was far more important. Even if it took a month to go over it all, he would still have to do it. Though, Lionel was confident he didn't need so long. Judging by his pace, he would need 3 days at most to go over information it took the Radix centuries to gather. And that was only because the Radix stored their information in a language Lionel wasn't used to. Lionel blazed through the information one after another. He was immediately intrigued to find that the waters in the Milky Way were much deeper than he thought, and the center of the storm was most definitely the Milky Way Guild and its seated council. According to this information, the Radix and the others had been slowly infiltrating the Milky Way Guild for decades already, slowly pushing their pawns into positions of power on the Guild's governmental body. Just one wife. A seemingly ordinary lady. Only 2 legitimate children, and one of them is Era. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Lionel's gaze narrowed. This guild head Ovaltine was definitely a difficult character to read. And Era was maybe even more intriguing. How had Era, the only legitimate daughter of the most powerful man in the Milky Way, end up the fiancée of a man from a 4th-dimensional world? The answer was obvious: Earth. From the very beginning, that had been the target. But it seemed that Augustus had nothing to do with Era's actions, so did that mean that father and daughter were working separately toward the same goal? A way to throw off the scent of those who were gnawing at their family wealth? Or was it that father and daughter had the same goal, but were rather competing against one another? Right then, a violent spark of lightning tore a path through Lionel's dreamscape. Era Ovaltine. Age, 4x Ability Index, Soul Manipulation. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Lionel's gaze sharpened, his aura fluctuating wildly. She's alive. Chapter 1052. Lionel sat in silence for a long while before he relaxed slowly. Well played. A small smile crept up on Lionel's lips. Truthfully, he wasn't sure exactly how valuable this piece of information was just yet, but he knew that it at least held a small bit of weight to it. At the very least, it was better than going around without realizing that there was likely a guillotine hanging over his neck. There's a 78% chance that the woman directing Elther and the others is her. It seems unlikely that there'd be anyone else with the resources and the forethought. As Lionel continued to read about the powers of the Milky Way and cross-referenced them with the information Elther had told him about this mysterious woman, the percentage ticked upward until it sat nearly at 100% by the end of the Radix family's reading material. Lionel stopped reading for a moment and he almost laughed. There was a saying on Earth said the world was small, but could you really say the same thing about an entire galaxy? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The Oryx had become one of Era's most important trump cards, but those hired guns were actually Lionel's own men. Even if right now it wasn't certain that they'd follow him, Lionel only needed to make a single sacrifice to ensure that this 50-50 chance would become a 100% chance of ruining Era's plot. It was simple as resurrecting Elther's father. Although Lionel couldn't guarantee that the Oryx King would follow him, what he could guarantee was that he'd be able to take over the Oryx from Era's hand. In addition, Lionel had already seen that man's character and his willingness to sacrifice. There was no way he would refuse to do Lionel, the man who gave both him and his son another chance at life, a favor. Lionel delicately formed dreamscape after dreamscape, building a complex web of interconnected information by the time the third day came to an end. When he was finished, he was certain that he knew more about the situation in the surrounding 9 or so galaxies than any individual in the Radix family did. I see, so things are like this. Lionel finally felt that he had gained a small grasp of the dimensional verse. The section of the universe he was in right now was dominated by humans. The Radix didn't know much about the strongest families, but they knew enough to understand that the most powerful existences here were of the 7th dimension, which made sense since information about the 8th was practically folk tale, if it existed at all. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The section was known as Domain and was known by races outside of it as the Human Domain or Humanity's Domain. Though there were other races sprinkled about this domain, like the Oryx or the Demons of Avalon, for example, over 99% of the population was human. This made Lionel wonder what other domains might exist, but the Radix family's scope was far too small to have this information, as it seemed that domains usually kept to themselves. A domain was broken into sectors, sectors were broken into galaxies, and galaxies were broken into quadrants, which further fell into solar systems and ultimately planets. Folds of reality were outside these common groupings because they tended to vary wildly in size. As for a sector, it could encompass anywhere from 10 to 20 galaxies, sometimes more depending on several factors. This sector, denoted by a string of numbers and letters by the Radix, was ruled by 3 powerful existences. Though, ruled wasn't an appropriate term. It was more accurate to say that these 3 could move unopposed, but they didn't usually have a reason to pick on weaker powers. Surprisingly, one of these 3 powerful existences was exactly the Luxnix family. As powerful as Lionel's Morales family background was, in this sector of the universe, it would ironically be more beneficial to him to identify as a Luxnix than a Morales. The dimensional verse was simply too large to expect weaker powers to immediately recognize the hallmark of extraordinary lineage factors. It wasn't even certain if many would understand the snowy star owl when they saw it. I'm finally not too ignorant about how these things work anymore, only took almost 5 years. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel laughed to himself and shook his head. Still, what was maybe the most fascinating about all of this wasn't the dimensional versus structure, it wasn't the information on the Umbra or the Rain, and it wasn't even the fact that Era was most likely still alive. No, the most fascinating was the history between the Flora family and Radix family, not to mention the reason the Radix and Midas family seemed to be such a solid alliance. According to their history, this all began over a zone. Not just any normal zone, but a variant zone. In fact, that alone wasn't enough to paint the picture. Because the truly shocking realization was that it was a variant zone not for one of the 3 families. but rather a variant zone apparently related to the Silver Empire. If Aina had been there to see Lionel connect such dots, she would have been shocked as well. The Silver Empire? Wasn't that the fallen empire whose zone Aina had entered just a few months ago? In fact, it was because of that zone in specific that Aina caught the eye of Richard's subordinate. Of course, Lionel had no idea about this. He only found the root cause of this turmoil to be fascinating. This could be considered to be a top secret of the Radix family. There was no doubt if more powerful existences knew that the variant zone of the Silver Empire fell into the hands of 3 comparatively fodder families rather than the former ruler of this and multiple other sectors. It was impossible to tell how they would react. Visit. For a better user experience, however, maybe the greatest irony of it all was that this was the fault of no one else but the Silver Empire themselves. Chapter 1053. The Silver Empire was indeed to blame for this. Because they manipulated their zone so that others couldn't learn their secrets, their variant zone appeared in an obscure part of their empire rather than an easily accessible location. As a result, a zone that might have turned their fortune around fell into the hands of 3 small families who were still fighting over it to this day. According to the history, the ultimate treasure of the variant zone wasn't claimed by any one of the families. Instead, it ended up split, with the Radix and Midas claiming one half while the Flora family gained the other. Due to the treasure being split, neither group could gain the full and true benefits, and the result was what they saw today. Neither family was able to rise up to the level of the Silver Empire, but they weren't necessarily weak either. In terms of the power scaling of this sector, they could be considered to be in the dead center, maybe a tick above. The 3 families were definitely a restraining force on one another. If not for this, they would likely only be second to the Luxnix family and its 2 counterparts. But it was because they knew this that their greed for the entire inheritance was so fierce, resulting in all 3 parties suffering. As for why the Midas and Radix families came together, it was because they shared a half. Only by being together could they resist the Flora family. That also likely meant that the most powerful existences Lionel might have to face in this coming war were the Flora. Lionel's expression went cold as he recalled the practices of the Flora family. These were most definitely individuals that had committed too many sins to be left alone. Lionel took a deep breath and calmed himself. I've wasted enough time, I have to hurry or else all of this information will be meaningless. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience over there. The process for entering the 8i branch will take about a day and you will need to. Lionel placed down his badge, causing the words of the individual before him to get caught in their throat. The older gentleman didn't know what to say for a long time, his gaze slowly arching up to meet Lionel's own. Realizing his folly, the old man shook his head. Ah, esteemed crafter. Forgive me for my rudeness. Please be on your way. A cold sweat covered the old man's forehead. He knew that crafters tended to have terrible tempers, and one as young as this was even more likely to fall into such a category. Even though it wasn't an exact science to tell someone's age after the 4th dimension, the fact Lionel could still look so young and yet be a bronze crafter was impressive enough. Even the most talented force crafters this old man had ever seen were at least deep into their middle ages. However, Lionel just smiled, catching the old man off guard. He didn't even recover until Lionel had long since stepped into the teleportation platform and vanished. This. Did he just smile at me? That only meant one of 2 things, either he met a rare, nice person, or had come home tonight to find his family nailed to stakes and decapitated. The old man suddenly felt the urge to run. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Where is he? Who's here? Another old man with messy white hair rushed into a room as though his ass was on fire. No. His ass really was on fire. Somehow, no one had stopped him on his way here to point out that the back of his robes were quickly burning. Iselin. You're on fire. The middle-aged woman who had a cold sweat on her forehead identical to the receptionist from earlier flew into a panic. It was only then that the old man realized that he was indeed on fire. In fact, another few inches and his undies would be out for the world to admire. Iselin waved a hand and the fire shot into his palm. What are you shouting about? Where's the sixth-dimensional ore? The middle-aged woman was speechless. Wasn't it you who shouted first? And weren't you still shouting now? The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Lionel chuckled at this scene but didn't seem to mind. He had thought of using the sixth-dimensional ore in his creations, but he felt that using it like this was actually far better. The 8-eye branch was the largest and most powerful of the Force Crafting Guild branches in the Milky Way, information Lionel had thankfully learned from the Radix. Their reserves of riches made the Golden Path branch look like beggars and their influence was far greater. They were almost like a mini-main branch of this galaxy and actually had Tier 8 and 9 bronze crafters. Of course, Lionel knew that this was actually a recent change. Not too long ago, the strongest crafters in the Milky Way were just Tier 3 or 4 at best. But, a slight shift began to occur as the main Force Crafting branch began to send over stronger experts bit by bit. Obviously, this was all for the sake of taking part in Earth's fold of reality. The waters of the Milky Way were far deeper than Lionel had ever known. It really put into perspective how naive he was thinking that he could take it over in a few years. This aside, this made the 8-eye branch perfect for Lionel to target. So long as they made such a transaction with him, they would be biased toward Lionel to an extreme. Not only would this give Lionel a large amount of funds, but it would make perfect use of the backdoor the Golden Path branch had paved for him. With Lionel befriending the 8-eye branch with his ores and crafts, it would make it almost impossible for Shield Cross-Stars to continue to target him freely and would give him some added freedom. Lionel smiled and respectfully greeted Iselin. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Elder Iselin, I was indeed lucky enough to stumble upon a small ore of 6-dimensional metals. They're of little use to me now, so I wanted to sell them to your branch. Chapter 1054. Yes, yes, yes. Excellent. Bring it out, I need to see it now. I mean, I'd like to see it. Iselin was truly too excited. He reacted almost like a child on Christmas Day. It wasn't that he had never seen a 6-dimensional metal before. It was rather that he had never seen one that he would have the liberty of using and experimenting with. However, when he saw the metal Lionel brought out, he almost directly fainted from happiness. Is this refined? No, it's not just refined, it's perfectly refined. Iselin's hands trembled. He had expected to be given a 6-dimensional ore rife with impurities. Usually, the higher the dimension, the more difficult it was to deal with such things. Iselin was already prepared to lose at least half the ore's value due to his inadequate skill. However, this ore was actually perfectly refined. The refinement of ores worked just like it did for forces, not in practice but at least in theory. That was to say that ores became more powerful the purer their refined result was. In addition, the purer the resulting metal, the more powerful the subsequent craft would be as well. Most only had a single refinement technique they poured their heart and soul into for all their lives. However, Lionel had dozens at his fingertips and he usually decided which to use depending on the metal he was working with. It could be said that this first step of crafting was among the absolute most important. Visit. For a better user experience, that said, it had to be remembered that this ore was already partially refined by Roxanne, though not perfectly. Lionel had only re-refined it after breaking it down into its individual parts and separating them out. Ultimately, Roxanne had had 10 kilograms of 6-dimensional metals in his body, of which there was just one kind. This metal was in foundation type or like herb ore, except rather than solidifying foundation like herb ore did, it instead increased explosive and penetrative power. It was exactly this ore that allowed Roxanne to take his bronze crafts and make them no less lethal than many silver crafts. While it might sound odd that Roxanne only had a single type of this ore, it made perfect sense. After all, Roxanne was ultimately in the 5th dimension. Even if his knowledge extended into the limits of silver crafting, there was a limit to what his bronze force would accomplish since it was in the fifth dimension. Roxanne focusing on a single, optimal ore that could guarantee him a huge boost in strength was definitely the smartest decision. And it was a decision that also benefited Lionel greatly. This ore was known as Shearing Oregon. It was incredibly stable enough for Roxanne to trust it within his own body, and it also only needed small quantities to qualitatively change the strength of even lower dimensional ores. For a bronze crafter like Iselin who didn't yet have the skill to form silver crafts, this ore felt like the most valuable thing he had ever seen in his life. It represented not just research potential, but also a windfall of funds to help him reach the next level. The problem with silver crafts is that those from lower dimensions have problems using them properly. They often take too much skill or energy, which is why people usually stick to their own dimensions in many cases. However, with this shearing ore, Iselin could make fifth-dimensional constructions with the power of sixth-dimensional ones. If he found the right buyer, likely a rich family wanting to pamper a weaker youth, the amount of money he could make would be enough to support him until he entered the legendary ranks of silver crafter. Visit. For a better user experience, Iselin was so excited that he wanted to kiss Lionel on the face. Your price. Name it. Name it. Lionel laughed beside himself. The childish eagerness of Iselin grew on him almost immediately. He had half expected for him to have to show off some of his own strength to ensure that he wasn't scammed or strong-armed, but he had never expected the head crafter of this guild to be so straightforward. I'm willing to exchange this 5-kilogram piece of shearing ore for 10 billion contribution points. What do you say? Lionel had chosen to keep 5 kilograms for him and chose to give Iselin the other portion. However, he felt that this was more than enough to meet his needs. Deal. Iselin. The middle-aged woman who had initially met with Lionel, Alunia, was shocked. 10 billion merit points wasn't enough to empty their treasure store, but it was damn near close to that. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, what are you screaming about, woman? Is 10 billion merit points not worth 5 kilograms of a 6-dimensional perfectly purified metal? This isn't an ore. Iselin was usually fairly easygoing, but having his expertise questioned wasn't something he was willing to tolerate. He was just a step from the quasi-silver rankings, but that didn't mean he had gone blind by greed. There was a reason he didn't even try to strong-arm Lionel, and that was because he wasn't a fool. Such a young bronze crafter even holding such a perfectly purified metal. Wouldn't he be asking for death if he actually dared to slight such a young man? Even if he was beaten to death, he wouldn't believe that there wasn't an absolute expert backing Lionel. Plus, beyond that, the price was fair. Usually, no matter the proposed exchange rate, no one would ever trade in a 6-dimensional metal for any number of 5th-dimensional ones. But Lionel's ask for merit points, knowing full well there weren't 6-dimensional force metal or herbs here, was essentially doing exactly that. If anything, he was the one taking advantage of Lionel right now. It felt like a godsend was brought straight to his door. But Alunia wasn't trying to question the dollar amount. The problem was that this transaction would stall the work of the guild branch as a whole. And, if that happened, it might offend some of their more powerful backers. After all, those individuals in the shadows were why they had come to this backwater galaxy to begin with. This might spell trouble. Visit. For a better user experience, at least 2 more chapters coming later today. They'll try for 3, but at least 2 for sure. Chapter 1055. Iselin waved a hand. Stop, you're overthinking things. How this branch functions is irrelevant to them for now. In fact, it will probably be irrelevant for several decades. Iselin didn't say anything more since Lionel was right there. The only reason he had ever said so much was because he was getting annoyed and wanted to take this shearing ore away as quickly as possible so that he could start his research. Of course, though Lionel knew more about such words than Iselin thought, he didn't show any particular reaction, simply handing the metal over to Iselin, who all but squealed with joy. As for poor Alunia, she was still worried but no longer dared to do anything. Though Iceland had explained things away so simply, Alunia knew that things weren't so easy. It would only take one curmudgeon to ruin everything, and in the worst case, Iceland might even lose his position as branch head. But, at this point, Lionel didn't particularly care about it all. He was only smiling as he saw the points jump within his crafter's badge. With a wave to Alunia, he vanished, accelerating toward the storeroom with frightening speed. By the time Alunia realized something was wrong, she suddenly found herself all alone and speechless. Soon, she became a bit jealous of the both of them. The 8 Branch's treasure store was far beyond what Lionel had seen in the Golden Path branch. The storehouse alone was at least 1 kilometer long and about 200 meters wide. Though there was a large glass dome above that must have gone at least 50 meters upward, the shelves themselves weren't necessarily so tall. Each row of shelves only had 3 racks. The lowest rack was at eye level and the spacers between the racks were at least 2 to 3 meters. The organization of it all was immaculate and the storage was even better. The latter was the best Lionel had seen aside from his own snow globes, which could be considered near perfect. These storage devices weren't able to freeze force herbs and ores in their optimal states, but they were all perfectly temperature controlled to provide the best environment for each. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Being rich is nice. Just a single 5-kilogram piece of ore had netted him all of this. If Lionel wanted, he really could mostly clear out this entire storeroom. Not only did he had 10 billion points, but things here were cheaper than they had been in the Golden Path branch, so his points went further. It was like heaven for a crafter. Soon, Lionel calmed himself. What he needed was a systematic method of crushing his enemies. He couldn't get lost in the fascination of all of these ores and forget the task at hand. The first thing Lionel did was blanket the storehouse in his internal sight. In just a few breaths, he had a replica of the entire place in his mind and could even map out the ideal pathways for reaching anywhere in the most efficient way possible. Alright, good, the Umbra family. Great Darkness Affinity, the root of which is beast blood, not much unlike the Luxnix family and the Snowy Star Owl. The root of their strength is the shadow-tailed fox, and their strongest abilities are their concealment, and unlike other assassin-like families, they have great power output through the use of their tails. Aside from this, they have an immunity to poison and very strong mental defenses. The Rain family. Great Water Affinity, known for their rain lineage factor allowing them to gather small storm clouds above their heads and use the precipitation like needles. Their offensive output is lacking, but their area control abilities are frighteningly powerful, especially near high concentrations of water force. The Flora family, Lionel's dreamscape sparked and flashed, his mind spinning as he connected the ores around him to crafts he could make. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Despite the information that Lionel had, what was difficult to nail down was exactly how those families would react to him killing Roxanne. This meant that whatever crafts Lionel formed to counter them had to be mobile and had to work in a variety of environments. Got it. Lionel flashed and vanished. Hours later, Alunia stood within the storehouse with a blank expression on her face. It was she who was responsible for organizing this storehouse, so seeing the state of it now, she felt as though a little piece of her had floated away. Of course, Lionel hadn't left a mess, but the room itself felt so empty now. Rows upon rows of open storage systems lay before her, leaving the aged crafter at a loss for words. Alunia released a deep sigh and walked away. She moved back toward the guild house, making her way to Iceland's quarters and walking in without saying a word. The old man was hunched over his crafter's workbench, the back of his robe still mostly burnt. "Do you know who that kid was?" Alunia said. Why are you interrupting me?" Iceland replied, visibly annoyed. Visit. For a better user experience, he was Lionel Morales. What does this mean to? Wait, what did you say? Lionel Morales. Iceland coughed awkwardly. Tier 4 fugitive, Lionel Morales? Yes. Iceland scratched his messy hair. Well. I guess tell Shield Cross Stars that I change my mind. We can't help them. Alunia was speechless. Couldn't this be considered bribing? Where was his integrity? Right this moment, Lionel, who had left as quickly as possible just to avoid the possibility of being found out too early, was standing before the silver tablet. Of course, Lionel expected Isolin's reaction. After all, by the time he left, it was already too late for the Eight-Eye Branch to do anything. They were effectively stuck with him now, everything going just as planned. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience that said, Lionel wasn't thinking about that right now. Instead, he had steeled himself and made a decision. He had been saving up his energy to resurrect someone else, but the circumstances called for something different. Lionel stretched his hand forward. It was time to resurrect the Oryx King. Chapter 1056. The first thing that hit Lionel was the stench. It billowed into his nose and made his mind go blank. It was the kind of smell that could make a person pass out completely. But, luckily, Lionel was ready for this and didn't back down. The Oryx King's shadow slowly rose until he eventually towered over Lionel. When his gaze opened, an undisguised majesty swept forth, crashing against Lionel in waves. It was as though they were two polarized magnets set to the same path, repelling one another violently. If Lionel had been ready for the first wave to hit him, he had most definitely not been prepared for this second. However, even while being caught unprepared, Lionel's feet remained rooted to the ground. He felt something subconscious within him that made him feel like a step back now would mean a permanent step back for life. The Oryx King seemed to feel the same thing as he too didn't take a step back. Compared to his son, his reaction was much less confused, maybe due to the fact that he immediately entered a state of fight or flight because of Lionel's appearance. A human. No, this boy. Right then, the Oryx King seemed to remember everything up until the very moment of his death. The pores of the Oryx King closed, causing the pervading stench to recede and disperse in the air. He was used to dealing with humans, so he was aware that his own smell was a bit much for them to handle. If he disliked the human, he wouldn't bother to show this empathy. But, clearly, he had a good impression of Lionel. His head tilted down, his gaze landing on the silver tablet. A touch of a complicated emotion colored his irises at that moment, a sigh leaving him. So it really was this thing. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's gaze narrowed. He suddenly remembered that during his time in the Valiant Zone, Elther had come to him to convince him to stop attacking the human kingdom, or else the Oryx would be forced to pincer him from the back. Back then, Lionel had realized that the Oryx kingdom obviously feared the humans for some hidden reason, and it wasn't until after he learned of the silver tablet's existence that he understood exactly why. You knew about the existence of this thing? What else do you know about it? Lionel asked. The Oryx King's gaze turned dim for a moment, as though he was trying to recall exactly how he knew about the silver tablet. But, he realized that there were suddenly holes in his memories, almost as if he hadn't experienced these things personally but rather that someone had told him he experienced it. Lionel had expected something like this. After all, in a variant zone, the location was the future, but it wasn't a future that was set in stone. Rather, it was a glimpse into the future that allowed those of the path a chance to grasp an opportunity. So, the question was, if you entered a variant zone and are transported into the future, would the people you meet there have experienced time equivalent to the amount you had traveled for? It seemed like from the Oryx King's reaction that the answer was no. Maybe the people in the zone had been in limbo and had their memories given to them. This was a thought Lionel had had for a long time, but he found it difficult to accept. Wasn't this a person right in front of him, living and breathing just like he was? How could their existence feel so flimsy at the same time, then? How could life be so casually created? Entry into the Valiant Zone wasn't the first time Lionel had had such a thought. In fact, it all started with the Camelot Zone and how they too entered reality. It was all too difficult to accept. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _ the website. For someone who liked to understand exactly how everything worked, it was too much for Lionel to handle, so, like most things he couldn't handle, he ignored it. Right now, he couldn't afford to have an existential crisis. The Oryx King shook his head again. All I know about this tablet is that it is a taboo. A great taboo. It shouldn't exist, and I would advise that you use it as sparingly as possible. Though the Oryx King said this, he felt that it would be better if Lionel didn't use it at all. However, he knew that with such temptation before him, it would be impossible to have him agree with this. Lionel remained silent for a long while before he sighed. It was impossible for him to not use this tablet. It was too important to his future thoughts and plans. He couldn't be a passive observer anymore. Oryx King, I need your help. Lionel explained things as clearly as possible, not leaving out any details. So you need me to take control of the Oryx, but haven't you forgotten something very important? I am only of the quasi-fifth dimension. In fact, from what it seems like here, even you are more powerful than I am now. Ruling without sufficient strength isn't ruling at all, it is being a figurehead. The Oryx King gazed toward Lionel deeply. It was clear that he believed that this was exactly what Lionel wanted him to be. Visit. For a better user experience, I will help you enter the fifth dimension. Lionel said. In addition, you are an Oryx who has completed your hyper-evolution, so your talent is greater than theirs. This breakthrough will make you far stronger than anyone they have currently. Also, I hope that you and Elther will choose to follow me, but I'm aware that it isn't something I can strong-arm you into doing. Instead, I hope that in exchange for this favor, that you will help me until this war ends. After that, you can make a decision. Follow you, HM? The Oryx King looked toward the tablet blankly. Within the human domain, species like his were at a disadvantage. It was impossible to grow without the backing of a human, but it was also impossible, normally, to find a human that wouldn't treat them like cattle to be reared and used. As for the kind of person Lionel was, the Oryx King didn't know. He had a good impression, but a good impression wasn't enough for a king to make a decision. At the same time, though, he was also keenly aware that whether the rest of the Oryx Kingdom was resurrected or not lay in Lionel's palms. Why would Lionel continue to spend resources resurrecting people who had no intention of following him? Even if he had a kind heart, he would probably go through all of the humans first, and who knew how long it would take to get to them? All right. I will help you with this war. As for what happens afterward, time will tell. The Oryx King slammed a fist into his chest, causing his ribcage to reverberate like a drum. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _the website. Hours later, Lionel was streaking through the skies once more, this time headed back toward Earth X1 at full tilt. Since those families wanted to play, he would play. By the end of today, head clear Earth X1 of all foreign existences. Chapter 1057. Lionel slowly walked through a thick forest, his bare feet sinking into the nutrient-rich soil and making him feel as though he had truly become one with the earth around. Something about the wonderful smells and fragrances in the air made him feel particularly at peace, as though nothing in this world could stop him. Halt. The sudden voice was like a clap that should have stunned Lionel out of his odd state. And yet, Lionel himself didn't seem to notice it at all. His chest rose and fell with a steady cadence, his eyes half closed and his blood gliding through his veins with a silent smoothness. In that moment, an arrow shot for Lionel. The voice that had spoken earlier was one of the many scouting units on the periphery of this base. Normally, this individual would have shot first and asked questions later, but the appearance of a boy wearing sweatpants in the middle of the forest caught him completely off guard. No matter how he looked at it, Lionel didn't seem like an enemy. Realizing this mistake, though, the scout no longer hesitated. This reaction was far too weird. Even if Lionel was a normal boy, they had most definitely not sent any normal people here to attack Earth, so it was clear and obvious that no matter what, he wasn't one of theirs. In that case, he would attack first. But the result was completely out of his expectations. Lionel, who had been leisurely walking at a pace that hadn't deviated for even a moment, came to a sudden stop. If things continued like this, the arrow would miss him entirely. The latest _AP _SODIes are on the website. The scout was taken off guard. But, he quickly recovered. He realized that his intuition was correct. Lionel couldn't possibly be a normal individual. A deep sneer took hold of his features as his finger curled upward. There was a reason he was chosen to be a scout. Not only was his internal sight powerful, but his ability was quite helpful for his marksmanship. The arrow suddenly curled upward. It couldn't change path enough to pierce Lionel's chest, but it could definitely tear a hole through his kneecap. By that point, the end of the battle would already be in sight. The scout expected to see Lionel's calm expression finally break and for there to at least be some panic or sudden movement in those final moments. But, reality was completely outside of his expectations. Not only did Lionel show no fear. He didn't move a single inch. Clang! The arrow tore through Lionel's sweatpants and seemed to have pierced him. But, not even a split second later, the sound of metal clanging against metal resounded through the forest. Lionel took a step forward, his body flickering with dense bronze runes. The sun hanging high in the sky, partially masked by a few white clouds, sent beams through the dense foliage that rebounded and reflected off of his skin. A slight wind whipped by, pressing Lionel's already tight compression shirt even more firmly onto his body. The outline of his torso made it obvious that his already toned stature had become even more so, even the line of his muscle fibers being clear beneath the fabric. The latest _AP _SODIes are on the website. Lionel's fingers lightly reached out for the air, causing the arrow, which was now flipping through the air, to suddenly come to a stop, pointing directly toward the scout in the distance. The metallic tip trembled as the scout tried to retake control of his own arrow, but he immediately realized that it was futile. The scent of death loomed over him, his heart quaking beside himself. Enemy ATT. PCHU. The scout never saw how the arrow closed the distance. His voice came to an abrupt stop, the gurgling of his blood filling the once silent forest. Things fell into a peaceful quiet once more, but this only lasted for but a moment before the blaring signs of horns raged through the trees. The sound was so loud that the leaves rustled and were stripped from their branches while birds and beasts alike scattered, running for their lives. Lionel didn't seem to notice the noise at all, his finger beckoning forth once again. The arrow that had just pierced the scout's head suddenly whizzed back toward Lionel, changing direction abruptly and shooting off into the distance. Once after another, cries muffled by the blaring sounds of horns resounded. And yet to Lionel, each might as well have been right by his ears. The latest _AP _SODIes are on the website. Right this moment, all around Earth X1, battles had erupted. Despite having taken control of the two most strategic points on the planet, Lionel didn't choose to stay back on the defensive. Instead, he chose to raise an all-out assault, one that would sweep through the planet completely. Arthur had been charged with wiping out the Umbra. With his light elemental affinity and the Camelot troops to his back, he was the best suited to dealing with them quickly and efficiently. Mordred was tasked with taking out the Rain family. Her area of control magic was the best among the Earthlings Lionel knew and had a chance to counter the Rain. At the same time, the strong bodies of the demons who followed her were perfect to deal with the advantages of them as well. Lionel's brothers were tasked with clearing Earth X1 of all Florer family members. These were maybe the strongest experts on this planet, and they were individuals that deserved the attention of as many upper-class talents as possible. Lionel had full faith that his brothers would be able to send them away with their tail between their legs. This only left the remnant of the Crawers. This task was left up to Lancelot and what remained of the knights and mages of Camelot. This group would have, by far, the largest numbers and would be perfectly equipped to counter the large number of Crawers. By now, it was obvious that this still left one more group. In fact, it was a group of two families, the Radix and the Midas. As for that, wasn't that why Lionel was here? One with metal affinity. The other with fire affinity, for such an enemy, Leonel Morales alone was enough. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Second chapter coming. Chapter 1058. Bang! The first line of defense crumbled, clearing the forest of trees to reveal a mighty metal fortress. With every step Leonel took forward, a silver armor slowly manifested, following the upward trajectory of his bronze halo and coating his body 1 inch at a time. The instant the last of Leonel's hair vanished beneath the helmet of silver, a flourishing spatial domain swept over the surroundings. Right then, it felt to all those in the surrounding several kilometer radius that every effort to move took twice the speed, twice the power, twice the will. On the top of the enormous bronze metal fortress, several ballistae aimed for Leonel, each controlled by an individual. Though the Radix and Midas hadn't thought that anyone would attack them so blatantly, that didn't mean that they weren't ready. Even as Leonel's domain fell, they reacted quickly. The arms of the marksmen bulged and pulsed as they swung the huge machinery toward Leonel. Their blood pumped and veins threatened to burst along their foreheads. They were strong men and women to begin with, but the abilities of Leonel's divine armor made it feel like they were toddlers trying to pick up something heavy. Leonel's steps didn't slow. The looming metal gates made him sigh inwardly. He had already expected that he wasn't the only one capable of quickly building up a fortress, so that wasn't what made him react this way. These individuals came from their worlds to claim a piece of earth for themselves. In doing so, the first thing they did was destroy the land. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Leonel could tell at a single glance what had happened. They had dug out the soil for more than 100 meters, destroying nutrients that had taken thousands of years to build up. They filled that hole with all sorts of metals and stone to build the foundation of their behemoth-like fortress. They shredded the trees, chased away the animals, and completely upturned the balance of the nature. There wasn't a single ounce of respect. Bang! Leonel vanished. In that time, tens of ballistae sent violent beams of energy, drawing a line through the land where Leonel had just been. The massive arrow heads dug deep into the rich soil, causing an eruption of it to be thrust into the air, all while uprooting several trees. It seemed at first glance that Leonel had already been hit. The timing was simply too perfect. By the time the marksman realized that the weight of Leonel's domain hadn't vanished yet, it was already too late. Two heads flew into the air, sparkling fountains of crimson following their arc. Leonel lightly stepped onto the top of the fortress, his armor releasing gentle clinking sounds as he touched down. Space Elemental Master. Visit. For a better user experience, the shout rocked the fortress. The weight of such words were heavy to the greater dimensional verse. The rarity of such existences couldn't be understated, and their impact on a battlefield was even more exaggerated than their rarity. However, due to this, how could powerful families not have certain counters? The moment the words fell, a strong churning took hold of the fortress. It was subtle to most, but Leonel's internal sight had already been placed on high alert. The moment things began to change, he sensed the shift of force and realized that it was being deployed toward a large-scale force art. Leonel concluded his deductions in an instant and sprung into action even faster. His twin-bladed spear had already appeared in his palms, the gaze beneath his visor having touched upon a startling coldness. He no longer saw life and death, he only saw numbers and their computations. Leonel kicked at a ballistae, sending it flying across the ramparts. Under a combination of his strength and his metal control, the heft of the projectile system alone crushed everything in its path. The harsh sound of screams and shattering bone and flesh resounded. Leonel didn't stay to watch the end result, nor did he need to. With his internal sight, everything was under his control. His spear whipped outward, slicing a door that led down into the fortress. Judging by the reaction of the force, this is definitely a spatial type array. The formation should cover the entire fort and disrupt spatial force. It will make it difficult to have controlled teleportation and will distort my domain. There's about 37 seconds left until the force art is fully deployed. Lionel completed his calculations in the time it took him to step through the door. His spear swept forward without regard for the low ceilings and the narrow walls. The blade was so sharp that one would have thought that Lionel was out in the open. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. With every head that flew and body part that was severed, another deep gash appeared on the thick metal walls. In fact, sometimes Lionel's movement was so quick that he would have taken 2 to 3 steps forward before the blade mark even appeared. Level 2 spear force seemed to be unstoppable. Even as warriors rushed up the stairs, thinking that the enemy may very well still be beyond the walls, they found themselves adding to the pile of flowing blood and flesh. Within the depths of the fortress, the upper management of the Radix and Midas had already been alerted. With Libli captured, things should have fallen under Dinmo's control. But, in reality, things were being run by an elder individual of the Radix family, as Libli knew well that Dinmo couldn't be trusted with such things. In fact, Dinmo was currently being shackled and jailed. When he learned that Libli was captured, he had wanted to rush out as fast as possible to get her back. But, he ended up being held back by others who said that would be a foolish choice. Dinmo didn't even like Libli very much, but he still became furious. Just yesterday, he lost his temper completely as he was tired of waiting, but that also just so happened to be the day the Radix and Midas had sent someone to inform them about the plans for the coming weeks. As for who that person was, Lionel would recognize him very well. After all, just 3 days ago, Lionel had almost killed him within a teleportation formation. Sir Daikon. The fortress. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Daikon held up a hand, his gaze filled with bloody murder. I know. Hurry up and release Dinmo. Hell, finally have someone to vent on. Chapter 1059. 34 seconds. Lionel's steps didn't pause, nor did they slow. Beneath his spatial domain, the enemies he came across didn't stand a single chance. With many of the numbers that made up the Radix and Midas being lower fifth-dimensional existences, all it took to cut them down was a single swing of his spear. Lionel reached the bottom of the steps. His foot kicked outward, a warp in space following his actions. His control had gotten so smooth that whether it was stacking space or splitting it, it could be done as easy as breathing. Bang! The heavy metal door, weighing at least a ton, went flying from its hinges, the center where Lionel's foot contacted crumpling up like aluminum foil. A line of warriors on the opposite end found themselves in a splatter of their own blood, their vision going black and their lives fading before they even registered what had happened. The moment Lionel stepped out, a rain of projectiles shot for him. But, his expression didn't so much as flicker beneath his visor. In the blink of an eye, the space around Lionel stacked and folded upon each other. One after another, the projectiles flew by his arms, legs and head, drilling holes into the metal frame to his back. At just a single glance, it looked like the marksman had tried to lance a fish through the water, but the image distorted, causing them to miss completely. Clearly, Lionel had expected exactly this much and took another step forward. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, the opening beneath the stairs to the ramparts was an open space to yet another gate further ahead. If Lionel wanted to shut down the large-scale force art before it activated, he would have to cross through this second gate. However, the space had distorted too greatly for him to trust leaping toward that location already. In addition, Lionel could tell that there were several hidden force arts baked into the thick metal walls that would make his attempt impossible. Lionel's spear spun, its body separating into 3 pieces connected by chains. With deft control, Lionel manipulated the length of these chains. It felt as though the entire field was filled with Lionel's spear force. Every time it cut across the air, a light of white was left like a cyclone of blades and wind. With every spin, another head flew into the air. The cold calculating light in Lionel's gaze becoming the arbiter of the Reaper. Clink. Lionel's spear snapped close, the light sounds of his footsteps reverberating through the blaring sounds of warning as he stepped toward the second gate. His body flashed, his singular stride crossing dozens of meters as he reached a hand toward the metal doors that appeared much more like the gate to a vault than a fortress. As though it was a cue, it was only after he did so that the headless corpses of the warriors that had come to stop him slowly fell to the ground from their feet, the dull plopping noises playing like a horrific symphony. Lionel closed his eyes. The effort it would take to slice this vault door apart was too much, and he had to be mindful of his stamina. However, brute force wasn't the only thing he had available to him. It took just a moment for Lionel's gaze to snap open. Little Tolly. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel hardly needed to think a thing. The tacit understanding between himself and his metal spirit had reached an unconscious level. No matter how majestic these doors seemed. What were they in the face of Tolliver? Bang! The vault doors broke beneath a single punch, fissuring at odd angles and collapsing before Lionel one step at a time. The warriors on the other side could only watch on in horror as metal doors dozens of meters crumbled. Many of them had their radix armors on, ready for battle, while another half had blazing tornadoes of fire around themselves. They had all been prepared to whittle Lionel down, and in the case he made it so far, take him down. But the ultimate result was completely out of their expectations. It hadn't even been 10 seconds since the warning blares begun, but he was already here. The glistening light of Lionel's silver armor sparkled beneath the falling shards of metal. Even amidst all the destruction, he remained the center of attention. As the last of the vault doors collapsed, Lionel took another step forward, the might of his spatial domain suddenly becoming exceedingly heavy. If they had experienced a light pressure before, they were now feeling the full brunt, even to the point they found it difficult even to lift up their arms. For Season's realm. A violent pillar of universal force shot down from the skies, crashing down to Lionel in waves. It spun about, fusing with Lionel's king's might and causing the warriors before him to tremble in fear. Summer. Radiant Core. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, a delicate orb of silver red appeared above Lionel. The oppressive heat shrouded the large opening, causing even the metallic walls to begin to slowly melt. Fall. A slow death. In the surroundings, gently falling fall leaves formed, dancing about in the wind. They seemed to be formed of delicately sculpted flames, and yet they looked so real and tangible at the same time. Some were a pale gold color, others were a deep red, and the remainder were pale silver. Winter. Withering snowfall. The skies darkened as ash began to fall from the clouds above. Upon closer inspection, this ash seemed to be snow. But it reverberated with the deep scent of death. The gray flakes filled all those who saw it with fear, making one believe that their very lives were withering right before them. Spring. Golden drops. A dichotomy of gray and gold began to play. One was the slow falling clouds of ash, while the other was the much heavier droplets of golden rain. They pelted against the ground, balancing slow and fast, bright and dark, death and life. It was the perfect duality. SHU. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel vanished. Chapter 1060. The warriors immediately understood what they were seeing. There were a few of them who had mastered one or two facets of the Four Seasons realm. But a complete cycle was something rarely seen. It was enough to make them stunned for just a moment. It had to be remembered that just because many people of Earth had grasped the full cycle, including Old Man Hutch, Arnold, and Noah, to others, even in six-dimensional worlds, they may very well go their entire lives without meeting even one such person. However, that was all it was, rare. It wasn't enough for them to feel fear, or at least, it shouldn't be. The Four Seasons realm was good for helping someone of the fourth dimension to cross the barrier and challenge those of the fifth. But, after stepping into the fifth dimension, it should have become less useful than true fifth-dimensional force. So, why the hell was it that this Four Seasons realm seemed to be so powerful? Before they could even get their answer, Lionel had appeared before the first Radix family member. He was a man of tier 6 and an individual greatly confident in his strength. If not for this, he wouldn't dare to stand at the vanguard and hold his ground. He reacted quickly to Lionel's arrival, swinging a chainsaw arm down toward Lionel. Though his confidence had waned somewhat, it wasn't enough to erase decades of training. There was simply no way that he would freeze up in such a critical situation. Unfortunately, Lionel's radiant core appeared before the swinging chainsaw. A strong repulsion force suddenly formed, powerful electromagnetic forces bombarding against the assault until it found itself completely unable to move forward. At the same time, the heat was so overwhelming that the warrior felt as though his own mech suit had become an oven, his components melting all around him. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. He was stunned into silence. How could it be so hot? These were the last thoughts he had before Lionel's spear ran through the back of his head. Before he had even fallen, Lionel had shot away, a path of gold appearing beneath his feet. Everywhere Lionel appeared, his radiant core would lead his vanguard. Its abilities seemed to practically be untouchable. Its repulsion forces were exceedingly strong, the heat it gave off was even stronger, but its hidden danger was even more devastating than any of this. It wasn't just fire force, it seemed to carry the effects of radiation. When it wasn't touching you, its existence was oppressive enough. However, the moment it did touch you, it felt like you would crumble long before you even began to melt. This was the power of radiant fire force. It was as though Lionel had the power of a nuke at the beck and call of his blade. One could only imagine what would happen if he ever allowed it to explode. The roars of the Midas family members billowed forth. The massacre of the Radix was so completely one-sided that they realized it was impossible to stay idle any longer, and many charged forth completely disregarding the consequences. However, Lionel's movements didn't slow in the slightest. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Everywhere he appeared, he effectively cut off the charge of the Midas. It was clear that they hadn't been able to get into proper formation before Lionel appeared, or else they wouldn't have been so helpless. The Radix fell one after another, Lionel's clever footsteps using their half-collapsed corpses like shields as he shot through the battlefield. At that moment, a Tier 7 existence of the Midas furiously roared. It was clear that the Radix relied too much on their suits of armor to fight Lionel. The combination of Lionel's fire affinity and variant earth affinity was too much for them to handle. If they wanted to even out this battle again, they would have to be far cruder. Without regard for his comrades, the Midas warrior burst through, knocking several members of the Radix completely out of the way. He made a straight line for Lionel, his body billowing with flames and sulfur. There was something decidedly murderous about his eyes, and there was an explosiveness beneath his muscles that caused the layered space around Lionel to crack and crumble. But it was exactly then that the most horrible sight the Midas and Radix had seen since this war began occurred. A light breeze passed by, causing a gentle fall of ash to press against the cyclone of flames around the warrior's body. It seemed for a moment that he would just be able to shrug them off, but the reality was completely out of his expectation. Just the delicate petals of ash seemed to suffocate the flames like a blanket. By the warrior's third step, his skin of fire had vanished, leaving him completely exposed and allowing his face of shock to be clear for the world to see. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. However, before he could react to just what had happened, a droplet of gold fell onto his skin. The warrior was shocked by the heaviness, but other than this, there wasn't anything special about it. His body was far too powerful to worry about such a small, meaningless attack. Even though it left holes in the metal, he was far sturdier than that. But then a second fell. Then a third. Then a fourth. Very quickly, it became obvious that the golden droplets weren't harming him, but were rather spreading along his skin. The man was slowly becoming a golden sculpture, and his movements became more languid and labored. His every step became heavy and his knees buckled beneath his weight. His jaw popped with veins as he stretched for Lionel, but it was all meaningless as the last droplet fell, covering his face completely. At that moment, the fluttering fall leaves fell upon the man's body. Soon, he became like a collage of tree leaves, covered by an assortment of pale colors. Others rushed to try to save the man, but reality was cruel. The moment a second Midas touched him, the man crumbled, his body falling into a pile of ash. Visit. For a better user experience, the beautiful fall leaves fluttered away, painting a gorgeous scenery. No one could ever guess the horror hidden within them just from this image alone. Chapter 1061. The Radix and the Midas were shocked to the point of not knowing how to react. Wasn't universal cycle comprehension supposed to be supplementary? It could form all of these pretty pictures and sights, but ultimately they would just be that. The true lethality of it all should have been hidden within the fists, weapon, or element of the person using it. However, completely out of their expectations, Lionel's Four Seasons realm actually had attacking potential all of its own. The worst part was that Lionel had made them think that it was completely harmless by making it so that none of them were attacked previously, all so that he could completely catch them off guard when it was far too late. The worst about this was that aside from some loss of focus, none of the strength of these abilities rested on Lionel's shoulder. Because they were manifested by universal force, Lionel's stamina was practically untouched. With the strength of his mind, how could he not sustain the images and artistic conceptions of a realm that even fourth-dimensional existences were capable of using? And now that the cat was out of the bag, he had no need to hold back any longer. Bang! It felt as though the skies had opened up. The snowfall of ash, the rain of gold, the fluttering of leaves, it all came together to paint a gorgeous but deathly picture. In the center of it all, Lionel became like a reaper, the lantern of which was none other than his radiant core. Everywhere it went, it repelled attacks, burnt the ground to a crisp, and unleashed waves of violent radiation that made one's skin curdle and boil. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The results were absolutely horrific. The synergy between Lionel's spatial domain and his Four Seasons realm turned the Radix Midas fortress into a disaster world of its own. Withering snowfall made it almost impossible for anyone other than Lionel himself to gather and use force. Golden drops turned poor, unsuspecting, otherwise valiant warriors into gold statues that froze the horror on their faces. And, finally, a slow death whistled by their ears, crumbling what remained of them to ash and leaving absolutely nothing for them to be remembered by. 7 seconds, Lionel's body was like a fluttering wind, calculating every angle of the battlefield, every line of sight, and every powerful strike. It looked to an outside observer like he was battling hundreds of warriors all alone, but the cleverness of his steps made it so that only at most 4 at a time could even dream of aiming for him. At the same time, the various stacking effects of his area control skills made it almost impossible for these 4 to gain any sort of support. Lionel's toes lightly tapped against the ground, the halo above his head vibrating slightly as he vanished. When he reappeared again, he stood in an inconspicuous location, the winds around him growing violent to the point they could be seen with the naked eye. Lionel rose his spear in the air, surges of force brightening around him. Tangible spear force that somehow appeared to be both real and unreal manifested, tornadoing around Lionel like numerous blade arms. Right at that moment, the reinforcements surged into the loading region. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The truth about this location was that it was where the Radix and Midas brought in all their supplies. It was a region designed for heavy machinery to be moved around constantly as the fort was reinforced and strengthened. It was clear that this place wasn't quite designed for battle, but it wasn't vulnerable to it either. Though enemies were never meant to make it past the second gate, that didn't mean they weren't ready for the worst-case scenario. This was exactly why the design of the Radix was so clever. In this sort of large region, littered with heavy machinery to the sides and with walls blanketed with thick silvery metals, one would never expect to find the core of this fort's formations here either. The others had likely believed that Lionel would rush off to the core of the base, hurrying toward their decoy. They didn't believe that anyone could deduce the true location of the formation even with time, let alone in the less than minute it had been since Lionel entered this place. Unfortunately, reality was cruel. Daikon, who had just followed Dinmo in to watch as they forced Lionel toward a slow and agonizing death, suddenly froze. Stop him. It was far too late for that. Bang. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Lionel's radiant core crashed toward the thick metal ground first. It hovered between the metal and Lionel's spear, violent swirls of spear force suddenly beginning to spin around it faster and faster. It seemed on the surface that the most powerful ability of Lionel's radiant core was its radiation. But Lionel was of a vastly different opinion. When one thought of a planet, what was its most powerful force? Lionel didn't feel comfortable taking little Tali out in such a large-scale battle. He had already almost gotten his partner hurt being too reckless back on planet Solara, and he had no intention of making the same mistake again. So, he would just have to show these people his most powerful attack in this state. The radiant core took hold of Lionel's force, bending it into a violent orbit. It all happened in the blink of an eye. In one moment Lionel had pierced downward. In the next, a vortex of force tore through the ground like a diamond drill bit, ripping the thick metal apart as though it was nothing more than thin sheets of paper. Lionel had hardly dug a meter deep before the radiation of the radiant core took hold, vaporizing the force art hidden below and causing the accumulating force to disperse. With a light breath, Lionel retracted his spear, his back straight and a deep hole of black before him. The fortress quaked beneath his strike even as his silver armor glistened beneath the silver-red hues of his miniature star. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 1062. For a moment, Lionel's slow and deliberate breaths became the only sound in the loading lobby. That attack just now was simply too shocking. They all felt that if they entered even the general vicinity of it, they would have been torn to shreds. At this point, they could only be happy that the radiant core was only the size of a palm. If it was any larger and retained the ability to send force, especially sharp level 2 force, into a wild spin like that, there was no telling the kind of devastation that Lionel could cause. As for Daikon and the members of the Radix family, their level of shock was even beyond the Midas. If it was the other regions of the fort, they might still be able to accept it. However, beneath the thick metal flooring, there was a highly compressed fifth-dimensional metal, processed via a special technique. The result was a metal alloy only marginally weaker than true sixth-dimensional metals. Though Daikon had roared out to stop Lionel, that was only meant to be a diversion tactic. He had, in fact, wanted Lionel to go all out. In the worst case for Lionel, he would end up killing himself. Even in the best case, his weapon should have been shattered and he should have suffered some terrible backlash. By then, the battle would be over. Of course, in the latter case, Daikon had no idea just how many quasi-silver spears Lionel had in his possession. However, the result was completely unlike anything Daikon had guessed, and he couldn't wrap his head around why. Even though that attack was powerful, it shouldn't be sixth dimension powerful. Just what was going on? Earth affinity. Daikon was formulating a thought in his mind, but, unfortunately for him, he wouldn't have the breathing room to finish it. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel took one final breath, his wrist turning slightly. A whirring sound manifested as the radiant core moved about his spear tip. Every time it shifted, a heat wave would spread and the smell of danger would linger in the air. Good. Now I can end this, Lionel said slightly. Daikon's facial expression twisted. The blatant disregard it took to send just a single person after another entire fort was already infuriating enough, but Lionel's remarks were even more unbearable. Before Daikon could do anything, though, Dinmo shot forward like a raging T-Rex. The clanging chains around his wrists and ankles had still yet to be removed. In fact, his feet were followed by bounding steel balls the size of his head, leaving deep craters in the metal ground as he rushed forward. In the blink of an eye, Dinmo had closed the distance and kicked out toward Lionel. The wind shattered and whistled beneath his might, the ball of steel following the arc of his kick. It was clear that he was completely enraged and recognized Lionel. While others were analyzing the situation, he didn't care to. Lionel watched on indifferently, his hands slowly reaching out. Valiant Seal. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience 4 sturdy pillars of metal rose out from the ground. In fact, the root of these pillars were the very same near 6-dimensional metals Daikon had been so confident in. From the moment Lionel had drilled through it, he had already begun to take control. By the time Dinmo attacked, he had already been circulating the force art for Valiant Seal for several seconds already. And, by the time the attack landed, bang! I see, Lionel observed without a word as Dinmo's attack sent a few ripples through the sheet of dense spatial force. He seemed to have realized something at that moment. This was, indeed, a Space-Earth dual elemental force art. Lionel had leaned in far too much on the spatial element as it was the most prominent feature of the technique, but the truth was that both elements were equally important, only then could the artistic conception be the most powerful. Until now, mostly due to circumstance, Lionel was always conjuring his Valiant Seal in the air, and sometimes he wouldn't even use the earth element at all. It was only this moment when Lionel finally properly infused the pillars into the ground as they were meant to be used that he realized just how powerful this technique could truly be. In fact, even the stamina drain was far less. Lionel hadn't cast Valiant Seal until just now, despite how useful it was in large-scale battles, because he was worried about the fluctuations in space caused by the fort's force art. But now he realized that his Valiant Seal was the perfect counter to it right from the very beginning. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel took another light breath, his gaze freezing over once again. As he had already said, it was time to end this. It was a complete, one-sided massacre. The combination of Lionel's Valiant Seal and his 4 Seasons realm made his defenses near impenetrable while making his offense potent to an extreme. Even when the Radix and Midas managed to coordinate their attacks well enough, it was all useless. Lionel was practically immune to fire while the mech suits of the Radix were too easily crushed by him one after another. By the time the armies realized that the only chance they had against Lionel was to use their abilities rather than relying on their lineage factors, their numbers had dwindled too greatly. To make matters worse, because they were now using abilities their allies weren't used to, they hindered each other more than usual, ironically making it even easier for Lionel to pick them off one by one. The only expert above Tier 7 they had was Daikon himself. However, he soon realized firsthand how foolish it was to try to entrap Lionel in a metal box. The entire fortress became Lionel's weapon. He remained hidden within his Valiant Seal, indifferently watching as he pestered Daikon to death. When the latter was at the end of his rope and prepared to take things to an extreme, he found an arrow right between his brows. Too powerful. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. These were the last words he could say before his head imploded into a rain of blood and gore. Chapter 1063. Lionel took deep breaths, sweat falling down his brow. All around him, corpses lay, blood flowing along the reflective surface of the now distorted metal fort. Lionel could have never done such an outrageous thing if not for the golden-scaled koi fish. Even if his strength was enough, his stamina wouldn't be. Plus, with his 3 vital stars, his Bodhi's innate fortitude was beyond anything his enemies could have ever imagined. With a single more deep breath, Lionel's breathing slowed, steam slowly billowing out from the layers of his armor. There's more than a few have escaped. Lionel looked off into the distance and through the 2 now collapsed gates. He wasn't a fool, he knew that there'd be some stragglers. But, just because he didn't usually spread out his internal sights several hundred kilometers for the sake of conserving his stamina, that didn't mean he couldn't do so. He was confident in dealing with those individuals very quickly. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel gaze shifted, landing on the body of Dinmo. He's alive? Daikon was most definitely dead. There was no way that anyone could survive having their head imploded like that. Well, maybe not nobody. At the very least, Era somehow managed to survive having her chest destroyed. However, Dinmo himself seemed to have survived Lionel's assault. With deliberate strides, Lionel made it to Dinmo's side and looked him up and down. Truthfully, Lionel was very interested in completing the Silver Empire's legacy, but not for himself. Lionel wasn't entirely sure what the complete inheritance was. However, logically speaking, it should be very powerful. Though, there was a chance it could be mediocre as well. It had to be remembered that the Silver Empire, at its peak, controlled several sectors all to its own. It was a powerhouse of epic proportions, and though Lionel hadn't asked the dictionary about it just yet, not having really had the time to focus on miscellaneous things, Lionel wouldn't be surprised if this Silver Empire rivaled or even surpassed the Morales family in the past. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience logically, then, a variant zone triggered by the coming crossroads of such an empire would be life-changing. After all, variant zones were depictions of a possible future and appeared when an empire or world had to make a decision that would decide its future life and death. Functionally, variant zones were the safest zones to enter. After all, they had to facilitate the hope of their generations. Why would it be made purposely difficult? So what was the problem then? Well, the main issue is the fact that the zone landed in the hands of the Florer, Radix, and Midas families to begin with. A variant zone's ease extended to the ability for its people to find it as well. It could be said that if Aina's luck wasn't extremely good, she as an outsider would have never had a chance at the Zone of Terrain's people. This made it obvious that the zone manipulation of the Silver Empire had led to all sorts of odd downstream effects. In that case, who was to say that the zone's rewards were as powerful as they should be? The only way for Lionel to find out would be to combine them into their true form and observe the outcome. If, at the same time, Lionel could get the helpers he would need for the Morales family's heir wars, then that would be a major plus. Whether or not he could actually do such a thing, though, was still up in the air. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience with the state of things, there was no way for Lionel to trust these people in battle. In addition, even getting them to fight for him would become a tall hill to climb. After all, what was he supposed to say? Sure, I massacred your people, but clearly you attacked first. That might sound logical, but when you were dealing with the emotions of others, things were rarely if ever so clear-cut. Still, Lionel had already begun to weigh his decisions on a basis of risk versus reward. He was likely far behind those other heirs, whether it was in development, connections, or starting point, he was severely lacking. If he didn't take risks, it would be nothing more than a dream to compete against them. In addition, on that stage, he would no longer have the advantage of talent and bloodline that he had been mostly relying on to this point as well. If Lionel learned anything from Kira, it was that comparing the talents of his corner of the dimensional verse to the true grand stage of humanity's domain was nothing short of foolish. Lionel had just defeated an entire army of existences between the Tier 4 to Tier 7 just now. If he tried to do the same to an army of comparable dimensional level from the Morales family, he wouldn't have even made it through the gate. Of course, if Lionel knew that he was also the youngest of the Morales family's 7 heirs, he would only be able to smile bitterly. Lionel shook his head, unconsciously looking down toward his right hip. Had his innate node not been taken, it would have been able to grow with him. Instead, because he rashly tried to form a 10th node out of it, it grew out of his control and now he couldn't even use his own strength. Even after entering the 5th dimension, Lionel wasn't sure how long it would take for his own power to truly be his own power again. Visit. For a better user experience, his gaze flashed with killing intent, his pale violet irises flickering with a crimson light. Lionel retracted his hand, realizing he almost crushed Dinmo's shoulder. With a single movement, Lionel tossed Dinmo into the snow globe. He would deal with the future when it came. Right now, he couldn't get ahead of himself. He couldn't make Earth the center of his kingdom if it was taken by others, now could he? First, he had to destroy these invaders. Chapter 1064. Lionel looked around the fort. It was a good opportunity and a wealth of riches, however it was also troublesome as well. With how large and thick the walls of this place were, it would take even little Tolly a few hours to work through all of it. No, I can't leave things like this, what would be the point? Wouldn't it be too foolish if he cleared this place of all its defenders, only to leave it and find more Radix and Midas had moved in? By then, it would be like he hadn't done anything. Lionel didn't have time to deploy a planetary force art like planet Solara had had. As such, it was too easy to move in and out of the planet's range. If Lionel left things here like this, the results were too obvious. Little Tolly, I'll be back. Lionel tossed little Tolly at the massive fort and vanished. He still had a few Radix and Midas to hunt down. By the time Lionel came back, the fort was razed to the ground, leaving nothing but a deep square down to the bedrock of the planet. Within this deep pit, large, perfectly spherical piles of metals lay. Just from these piles alone, there was over 500,000 kilograms of herb Oregon visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel was speechless. Every single last ounce was fifth dimensional. Was this the wealth of a sixth-dimensional world? This wasn't even meant to be their main fort. They originally wanted to claim on of the lake crossings. Just what kind of behemoth would they have built over there? At this moment, Lionel could only feel inadequate. My bounty was only 10,000 kilograms? Am I just a petty criminal? What the hell is this? Compared to the piles of herb ore, the rest was practically worthless to Lionel. It suddenly forced him to realize that he was much too poor. If a mid-level sixth-dimensional world was this wealthy, what about peak sixth-dimensional ones? Seventh-dimensional ones? Peak seventh-dimensional ones like the Morales family? Lionel was truly speechless. He had been controlling little Tolly from afar with his internal sight, but he didn't truly register just how much there was until right this very moment. And, despite all of that, Lionel felt that it was completely useless. He could probably buy a whole planet with this amount of money in the Milky Way, but what was the point? It took this moment for Lionel to realize just how small his scope on things was. Visit. For a better user experience, he was scratching and clawing for wealth in this tiny little corner of the universe while there were real whales out there laughing at his efforts. Even his own grandfather was probably laughing at him. He didn't even have to lift a finger to make thousands of times what Lionel had to lay his life on the line to get. Why did he waste his time going for these small fry, then? He was worrying about the wrong things. No, it wasn't that he was worrying about the wrong things, it was rather that he needed to work smarter, not harder. He was wasting his efforts and had to target the appropriate things. What good was it to build a shop on Earth so he could accept the patronage of people even poorer than himself? It was a waste of time. Noted. Lionel thought to himself. Lionel took the pillars of the near sixth-dimensional metal and placed them within a spatial ring. Then, he stored the herb ore away before sweeping a gaze over the remaining metals. Unsurprisingly, they were all related to defense, whether that was force absorption, shock absorption, or just overall sturdiness. They would be greatly helpful in upgrading the cubes, but Lionel had a feeling that the next wave of battles wouldn't be occurring on Earth X1. Lionel sent his senses toward the silver tablet. He didn't want to do this, but he knew that he would have to. His current strength wasn't enough, and if he wanted to use his trump cards, he had no choice. Before, he hadn't had enough resources to do it. But, after looting, exchanging his merit points at the 8-eye branch, he had reached his quota. It was time to push his metal body up to Tier 9. Though it would make his subsequent uses of the silver tablet cost more energy, Lionel had once again decided that the trade-off was worth it. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Not only this, but he would also have to use the silver tablet for one more thing. Once that was complete, the rest would be left up to fate. Not that Lionel had any intention of relying on such an enigmatic thing. Little koi fish, it's time to work. The battles across Earth X1 began to end one after another. The shock of Earth's sudden and aggressive counterattack left the invaders stunned. They had never expected that Earth would choose to do this despite having the clear defensive advantage. Their aggressiveness was outside the calculations of even the Radix, let alone the others. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Each assault unit was seemingly equipped with perfect counters to them all. The Umbra suddenly found that it was difficult to call upon dark elemental force. The Rains suddenly found that the weather itself was fighting against the formation of their clouds. The Krars was steamrolled, the number of machinery overwhelming their great population, leaving them without a choice but to surrender or be massacred. Each experienced a fate worse than the last. Visit. For a better user experience, reports of what was happening on Earth X1 returned to the approaching fleet of invaders as they cut across the stars. But it only served to accentuate the counterattack of those on Earth X2 as well, those invaders experiencing a story that was all too familiar. Fury bubbled forth as the fleet traveled through the depths of space, hearing the cries of their fellow clansmen ringing in their ears. Their blood boiled. They wanted nothing more than to see Earth dyed crimson. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.